Well, hello there guys. In 2010, the Google Books project attempted something incredible. They tried to collect, scan, and create a digital copy of every book in the entire world. Their definition of a book had to be somewhat restrictive. Firstly, they had to be printed and bound, no magazines, serials, videos, audio recordings, maps, etc. Second, there were no duplicates. Regardless of if a book had millions of copies or just two, it would be counted as just one distinct title. This also goes for identical books or updated editions simply published by different publishers. After all that, the project estimated that, added up in total, there were 129,864,880 books in the entire world. 9 years later, the project added another 40 million books, making an updated total of roughly 170 million books. Odds are there will never be an exact figure. Think about that. Every book you have ever read, or even thought about reading, or literally just saw on a bookshelf somewhere once, is included within that list. Within this number, you could find a book on practically anything you want. Fiction, non-fiction, fantasy, history, science, religion, mystery, horror, drama, romance, horny. It covers the widest range of information, knowledge, and genres. And there's so many oddly specific combinations. A book on yoga for horses? You got it. A complete and illustrated catalog of antique barbed wire? Oh yeah, baby. An illustrated manual teaching you how to create sculptures made purely of bread? Bake away, buddy. A 17th century gay Aztec romance novel. He took Quetzalcoatl to bed forthwith and asked him to promise to sing only for him. We live in an age of ever more accessible books, and I count myself very fortunate that I exist in a period of history like this. If you were persistent enough and had a lot of disposable time and money, you could conceivably read any one of the 170 million odd books out there, or at least skim read them. You could track down rare copies of certain books or learn a new language. Even if a title only has a couple dozen copies worldwide, or maybe just one copy in a secure vault somewhere, you could possibly track it down if you really wanted to. But there are some books that, try as you might, you can never read, no matter how hard you look. That's because they are just gone. Not a single copy exists anymore. All traces of these books, aside from in some circumstances a few surviving fragments, have been lost to time and turned to dust. And there's no way, aside from maybe time travel, to get them back, or be able to read them. This is the concept of a lost work, a document, literary work, or piece of multimedia produced sometime in the past, but of which no surviving copies are known to exist. They are books you can never read. In truth, we could fill a whole library of just these lost works, and I'd like to explore this library of forgotten books today. But to best understand how and why this happens, we need to briefly talk about the history of books and literacy. The history of literacy and books. Writing, or the usage of inscribed symbols to preserve knowledge, was invented sometime during the 4th millennium BCE, initially for the purpose of administration and taxation. For hundreds of thousands of years before this, generation after generation of humans had no other way to pass down the skills and information they acquired than to physically show or tell another person and hope they memorized it. In this way, writing extended the memory of humans beyond the single brain of a person and placed this memory into a book, or what scholars call an external storage medium. The earliest books were inscribed clay tablets, stones, and bones. Most recorded nothing more than simple tallies of goods, but over time they began to contain much more. Mathematical formulas, maps, prayers, conversations, diaries, dirty jokes, and stories. In Egypt, the invention of papyrus scrolls presented a lightweight, cheap, and portable writing material. By the time of ancient Greece and Rome, these scrolls were the dominant method of recording knowledge, and during this time thousands of diverse and unique documents were produced, covering a wide range of topics, genres, and themes, from the scientific and historical to the poetic and musical. It is important to stress, however, that few at the time could actually read them. According to modern estimates, only a small minority of adults in antiquity could read and write, less than 10% in classical Greece, and at maximum 30% in imperial Rome, which was perhaps the height of literacy until the modern period. Women were unfortunately largely excluded in both cultures, but exceptions did exist. Elsewhere, literacy was much lower. In the Middle East, India, East Asia, Northern Europe, and Mesoamerica, the percentages of people who could read and write was probably in the single digits. Even if only 10% of the male population could write in the Greco-Roman world, this was 10 times more than the ancient Near East, where literacy was in fact limited to a small class of specialists. And yet, even within these percentages, there were varying degrees of literacy. Most of this literate subpopulation was capable of reading, but incapable of writing. Many were simply what we would call now signature literate. In other words, they were barely able to scratch out their own names on tax documents, and didn't have the capability to write books or even letters for themselves. For the most part, being able to read, much less write, was a sign of elite status and prestige. Odds are if you weren't the son of a noble, or a general, or a wealthy merchant, you weren't reading much of anything. Books were also hard to come by. Before the invention of the printing press in 1440 CE, books of any kind were an expensive and relatively rare item. This was because they were all handmade. If you wanted a copy of someone's book for your own personal library, you had to wait for a scribe to tediously and painstakingly transcribe a new one for you, by hand, slowly copying every single word. Some works, particularly the lengthier ones, could take an entire year and multiple scrolls for a scribe to just make one copy. Also, there was no publishing for ancient books, so they circulated very slowly. A book first came into being when an author, or rather his team of scribes, would handwrite an original manuscript from his ideas and research. This manuscript would serve as the original master copy for all future manuscripts. From here, the author would order his scribes to produce duplicates, or identical copies of his book for distribution. Now, during the Roman Empire, if you wanted a copy of someone's book, you first had to be friends with them. I know, a terrifying concept. A Roman did not ask someone he did not already know to send a book, even about a subject in which they were both interested. We do not hear of a single author who gifted a copy to a complete stranger. Authors would give copies of their books as gifts, but they would do so exclusively within a close circle of friends, who kept them in their own personal libraries. Friends often borrowed each other's books, and when one friend loaned a book to another, the recipient could make a copy at his own expense if he wished. Copies of these were in turn gifted to others, and more copies were made available from these private copies. Over time, this network gradually increased the readership of an author's particular work across the Roman Empire. Similar analogies, albeit on a much smaller scale, existed elsewhere in the ancient world like in China. It is important to point out that no copyright existed either. Once someone obtained a text, anyone could copy it and sell it, with or without the original author's permission or even knowledge. This meant that there was no oversight or quality control for ancient books. If someone wanted to, they could change or alter their copy of a book at any time, subtracting a word, adding a word, or even inserting entirely new paragraphs to a work. We know that this happened pretty regularly too. The Gospels and Epistles of Paul, gaining popularity in the 2nd and 3rd century CE, for example, show clear signs of later alterations. Check out my Bible video for more information on this. Needless to say, access to books in general was very limited. You had to be not only elite, but well connected, so to speak. A papyrus letter discovered in Roman Egypt, dating to the late 2nd century CE, illustrates this nicely. A man asks his friend to make a copy of Hypsicrates, Characters in Comedy, Book 6 and 7, and send it to me. His friend later responded by writing, "Harpocration says Demetrius the book dealer has them. I have told Apollonides that he should send me for my own books certain ones that you'll learn about from Seleucus himself later. If you find any I don't possess, make copies and send them to me. Diodorus and his friends also have some I don't." A huge problem was bias. The number of copies a book had increased directly in proportion to the number of readers who wanted that book. This meant that popular books were gifted and copied more frequently than less popular or unpopular ones. This resulted in a select few titles being incredibly easy to find, with many thousands of copies in circulation across the Mediterranean, while others were exceedingly rare and difficult to obtain. A good demonstration of this can be seen with the fact that somewhere between 1/4 to 1/5 of all Roman text was the Iliad, particularly Book 1 and 2. The Iliad was the most popular book in antiquity, making it an incredibly easy to find book. Similarly, classics professor Reviel Netz theorizes that Roman library collections were dominated by the works of just 11 different authors. By contrast, less popular, minor authors had far fewer copies of their works in distribution. This was because there was less of a demand for them, making them rare to exceedingly rare. You might see where I'm going with this. This restrictive system, with a small reader base circulating a small number of book copies, was prone to loss. How books were lost. Since a relatively small number of copies of a text was in circulation at any given time, locating a copy could be difficult and time-consuming. The limited availability of ancient books was something often acknowledged by people at the time. We hear from several surviving sources that ancient readers commonly sought out books they did not have in their own libraries, and some were much harder to track down than others. In a letter, Emperor Julian the Apostate tells his friend Priscus, "Seek out for me all the writings of Iamblichus. You're the only person who can do that since your sister's in-law owns a well-corrected copy." Keep in mind, this is a Roman emperor we're talking about, and even he is having trouble tracking down this particular author. The problem of ancient books was that if your copy got damaged, maybe it got eaten by worms or was accidentally burned in a fire, a common enough thing in ancient Rome, well...
That's rough, buddy.
Because there's now one less copy of that particular book in the entire world. This might not be much of a problem for something like the Iliad or the 11 major authors, who had a surplus of widely distributed copies, but for more minor authors, this was a huge deal. You're nobody, Pindar. You'll only be a minor author. The number of total circulating copies might have gone down from 100 to 99, or 12 to 11, and it might be some time before replacement was procured, if ever. There were two main methods by which copies of a book could disappear: neglect and intentional destruction. Neglect was probably the most common source for the loss of ancient books. Papyrus rots over time, and mold, fungi, and bookworms constantly attacked Greek and Roman scrolls and codices. This was a creeping and gradual menace. If an owner noticed the threat in time and cared deeply enough about the book, they could commission a scribe to produce a suitable replacement, but this could be expensive and again, time-consuming. Fire was also a huge problem in the ancient world. An accidental house fire caused by a spilled lamp could spell disaster for entire libraries of books. During an especially awful fire, hundreds of book copies could be wiped out of circulation in an instant. Careless students eating and drinking around their favorite texts and damaging them in the process surely happened somewhat regularly as well. The intentional destruction of texts was also a major threat to books throughout human history. War and times of political instability were probably the most common culprit. Typically, when a city was sacked, buildings of all kinds were burned. During revolutions, administration buildings housing many books were often targeted in an attempt to wipe away any records of people's deaths. Censorship has always been a thing as well. Over the course of the Roman Empire, one author or another would fall into the bad graces of the emperor, and subsequently their work would be banned. The books written by this enemy of the state would be burned, leaving only the copies that existed in the personal libraries of secret fans. Religious movements could also drive censorship. During late antiquity, early Christians were partly responsible for the destruction of many ancient texts. Church fathers like Tertullian advocated for the systematic eradication of what he deemed pagan books and teachings. This process was repeated elsewhere in the world whenever new regimes took over and wanted to remove all traces of the old, from ancient China to the Aztec Empire. With the barbarian invasions in the 5th century CE and the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, literacy retreated in Europe. Literacy rates had never been too high in the first place, so this event spelled disaster for the preservation of many ancient works. Less and less people cared about books and reading in general. Over time, copies began to disappear, as incidents of neglect, accidents, and censorship accumulated. The total number of circulating copies of some books declined more and more, until the number finally fell to 0. This is how books became lost, and we know that this must have been commonplace. Even during the height of the Roman Empire, works would regularly fall in and then out of circulation. The Roman senator Cicero once wrote, "When we were boys, we used to think C. Fimbria speeches worth reading, though we can scarcely find them now." It's pretty sad to see that Romans during their own time talked about how books and speeches were being lost and forgotten simply due to this scarcity of copies. And this issue only became more prevalent as Europe entered the Middle Ages. Books that were copied the most survived more often, while less popular authors were more likely to fade into obscurity, until no copies of their work were left. It is likely that the majority of the works lost to us met their ultimate fate in someone's dusty old library, as worms silently ate the last copy in the dark. No one heard, and no one saw. The Lost Books. Now, with that background in mind and halfway through the video's runtime, let's talk about these lost books. How do we even know they existed? Well, we know about them through primarily two ways: books directly referenced or mentioned by surviving authors, and books inferred to exist. The first one is probably the easiest to understand. Within the books that managed to survive the centuries, we often see authors offhandedly mentioning or referencing books that were in circulation at the time but have since disappeared. They often name the author, the work's title, what it discussed, and sometimes, if we are lucky, they even quote directly from it, preserving a small fragment of what the original might have said. Other times we know precious little. Imagine trying to figure out the plot and scenes of a movie based entirely on the IMDb reviews. That's the extent of what we have to deal with some of these examples. Books inferred to exist are more mysterious and their identification is less certain. As stated before, the lack of copyright in the past meant that anyone could copy a work. Ancient writers regularly borrowed and rehashed the writings of older ones. Some authors even shared the same sources for their own books. So sometimes, just by comparing two or more surviving texts, we can infer the existence of a speculative original from which these both derived. Oftentimes, we don't know the name or author of this hypothetical source, but we can speculate about its content. In any case, I have compiled for you guys a list of the lost books I found most intriguing. I separated them into categories and provided a short description of pretty much all we know about them, their titles, authors, and what they may have contained in them. Scientific books. These are books relating to scientific discoveries in the past. In my opinion, the loss of these texts is probably not as bad as others because we can relearn and rediscover these findings, and by now we have largely progressed far beyond them. It's just a shame that these texts became lost because a lot of them show that even accurate scientific theories and knowledge can easily be forgotten with time. One wonders what could have happened to the trajectory of learning if these works were never lost in the first place. It also would be interesting to hear the exact methods and experiments by which some of these discoveries were made. Okay, first up is an astronomical work by Aristarchus of Samos, written sometime during the 3rd century BCE. Its title is unknown, but it was referenced by the Greek mathematician Archimedes a century later. The work is significant to us because we are told that it proposed a very radical theory about the universe. It appears to be the first known example of a scientist proposing the heliocentric model, that is, the idea that the Earth and other planets rotate around the Sun and not the other way around. Aristarchus theorized that the Earth revolves about the Sun, on the circumference of a circle, the Sun lying in the middle of the orbit. He also suspected that the stars in the night sky were just like the Sun, albeit much further away from the Earth, and that the universe is many times greater in size than the universe that had been previously accepted by other ancient scientists. It is unclear how Aristarchus arrived at this conclusion, but it seems likely that he may have used planetary orbits, eclipses, and shadows similar to another Greek scientist, Eratosthenes. As we all hopefully know, this idea is true. Modern science confirms that, although Aristarchus was not entirely accurate, he was definitely heading in the right direction when he proposed this theory, and it was miles ahead of the mainstream ideas of his time. However, we know that his theory did not gain much traction. Archimedes mentions it offhandedly as a largely forgotten alternative theory to the unrivaled geocentric model, which dominated scientific thought for literally thousands of years. In fact, Aristarchus' knowledge was not rediscovered until the Renaissance, almost 2,000 years later. The work was likely lost due to the unpopularity of its findings. Copernicus and Galileo received a lot of negative attention when they proposed the same ideas many centuries later, so we can assume that Aristarchus' book might have gotten a similar treatment in antiquity. On Nature by Anaximander, written during the 6th century BCE and known from the Roman writers Censorinus and Plutarch. Anaximander of Miletus was an Ionian philosopher about 300 years before Aristarchus. He is notable as an early champion of scientific thinking. Anaximander argued against deferring to magic, gods, and miracles. Instead, he believed nature was ruled by laws, and everything could be explained through natural, observable processes. Anaximander was seemingly very interested in the origins of humanity and all life. He composed a poetic treatise called On Nature, where he posited a scientific theory on how humanity arose. Censorina states that On Nature discussed how, according to Anaximander, all life first originated from a warm and hostile ocean in Earth's primeval past. From this environment, life was formed, initially as fish or fish-like creatures. Born inside these strange animals were the first humans, who took form as small embryos and fed like sharks. Eventually, they burst out of their fishy parents and washed ashore to live on dry land. These primitive humans had protective scales, but they lost them over time as they adapted and spread to this new environment. You may notice that Anaximander's theory sounds vaguely similar to modern scientific theories of the origins of life, such as abiogenesis and evolution, although his theory lacks much of the specifics like molecules and natural selection. In many respects, he was correct in positing that life originated from the ocean, and the imagery of a primitive fish-like human ancestor climbing out of the ocean evokes modern fossil discoveries like Tiktaalik and Ichthyostega, primitive fish and amphibians who pioneered our transition from living solely in the water to land. Crucially, Anaximander's ideas presented a scientific origin for humanity, rather than a magical one. On Nature in fact posits the first rudimentary theory of evolution in a world dominated by creationism, and much like Aristarchus's heliocentric theory, scientific thought like this wouldn't be resumed, at least in Europe, until the time of Charles Darwin, over 2,000 years later. It is unclear what pieces of evidence brought him to this conclusion. Anaximander probably expanded on them within the work, but it is likely that he used early fossil discoveries and experiments with animal embryos to inform his ideas. Unfortunately for us, however, On Nature fell into obscurity sometime during the fall of the Roman Empire. Odds are the book's revolutionary ideas were thought of as too strange and possibly even blasphemous for the incoming Christians, who preferred the more simplistic model of divine creation. Historical books. As much as we know about history, there are a lot of blind spots and patches of missing information for many events, areas, and even entire time periods. These following lost works could have filled a lot of these gaps and given far greater detail for the events we know of. For example, we know of no fewer than 11 different lost histories relating to the life of Alexander the Great. Each one of these would be far more useful and likely more reliable than the 5 ones that managed to survive to us, all of which are plagued with both heavy bias and, crucially, none of them are first-hand accounts, being greatly removed from the events they described, sometimes even centuries. For example, the lost history of Alexander by Ptolemy, his best friend and possible half-brother, would have provided a lot of unprecedented personal insight and first-hand accounts of many battles and historical events. We are also missing the personal diary and letters of Alexander, which were once available at some period in history, but have since disappeared. Several Roman emperors and famous historical leaders produced books that have been lost. We thankfully have Julius Caesar's account of his conquest of Gaul, but we don't have the works of Trajan, Zenobia, Septimus Severus, and King Pyrrhus of Epirus, among others. All these figures are said to have produced written works, but not a single one of them survives to us today. These books would have provided us a very rare and intimate view of history, giving these famous leaders and characters a voice of their own, as opposed to the very filtered perspective we often get from secondhand sources. Emperor Claudius was one of the most intriguing of these famous authors. He was a prolific writer and perhaps by modern definitions an early anthropologist. He was particularly interested in, and maybe even a fanboy of, the Etruscan people, the poorly understood predecessors to the Romans. After a ton of research, Claudius composed a 12-volume history of the Etruscans called the Tarinica. In keeping with his Etruscan weeboo status, Claudius even studied the forgotten Etruscan language to the point that he could likely read and speak it fluently. Subsequently, he made his own Etruscan dictionary to keep his scholarly exploits alive. Both these books didn't survive the Roman Empire, and Claudius's painstaking research was seemingly for nothing. After it was lost, historians had to restart from scratch. To this day, the Etruscan language is only partially understood by modern scholars, and the civilization itself and its history is likewise highly fragmentary. Claudius's dictionary and history volume could have been a huge help to us, but alas. Claudius also apparently wrote a book titled The Art of Playing Dice, but this was also sadly lost to time, truly the biggest blow to humanity's collective knowledge. Ooh, look at that. We also hear of a handful of books recording great voyages and adventures in antiquity. Nearchos of Crete was Alexander the Great's admiral and led his naval expedition from the Indus River Valley across the Persian Gulf to the Tigris River. Upon his successful return, Nearchus composed a memoir of his voyage entitled Indica, which, as it goes without saying at this point, has been lost. We are told from other authors that Niarchos' travels were crazy. He battled a pod of whales using only trumpets, and had discussions with the primitive and mysterious fish-eaters living on the Persian coast. Niarchos' voyage was the first time ancient Greeks encountered a true ocean, the Indian Ocean. Before this, they'd only been acquainted with the relatively calm Mediterranean Sea, so Niarchos and his crew were absolutely awestruck at the existence of tides in the Indian Ocean, a phenomenon they were completely unfamiliar with. Even more intriguing than Niarchos' ocean adventures were that of Pytheas of Marseille, recorded by Pliny the Elder, Strabo, and Polybius. Pytheas was another Greek explorer, and his voyage was straight up insane given the time period. According to his book, he went to lands no Mediterranean had ever been to before. The historian Strabo states that Pytheas asserts that he explored in person the whole northern region of Europe as far as the ends of the world. His written account of his adventures sadly does not survive. From surviving fragments preserved in the works of other authors, we know that in 320 BC, he ventured into the Atlantic Ocean and surveyed the northwest of Europe, to the mythical island of Britain, Scotland, and the Orkney Islands, and he went even further to a frozen ocean of shifting ice, where strange lights danced in the sky at night, and the sun shined at midnight. Wondrous story. And as such, many doubted the reliability of his descriptions. However, with the hindsight of history, we know that what Pytheas described was an accurate account of the Arctic Circle, and many of the natural phenomena that occur in it, such as the northern lights, the summer solstice, and polar sea ice. Pytheas' exact route is still debated, but he might have traveled as far as what is now Iceland. There were also some historical books that went incredibly far back, deeper in time than practically anything else that survives to us today. The famous historian Herodotus, writing in the 400s BCE, mentioned that the Egyptian priests of Hephaestus, Ptah, had a collection of ancient scrolls that clearly showed that the time between the first king of Egypt and Pharaoh Sethos was 11,340 years in total. He goes on to state that the Egyptians claimed their knowledge of these dates to be absolutely precise. The claims of the Babylonian historian Berosus are even crazier. His History of the Nation of Babylon, entitled Babylonica, was said to stretch back almost 500,000 years, 432,000 years in the past, when humanity still shared the earth with Neanderthals and Homo erectus. Both these works were likely not accurate or even reliable as far as information was concerned, and probably would have contradicted what we know from archaeology, but it would have been very interesting to see what they had to say nonetheless. Books for entertainment. These books were made largely not for education, but for entertaining and moving their readers, figuratively and in at least one case, literally. A lot of these works are plays, novels, and dramas that have been lost to time. The Myrmidons by Aeschylus, for example, was regarded as one of the most popular plays in antiquity. However, only a fragment of it survives today. Being a tragedy, it was a very sad play inspired by Homer's The Iliad. It portrayed the love between the two Greek warriors Achilles and Patroclus as a deep, intimate, romantic love between two men. In keeping with the Iliad spin-offs, we know that there was a lost epic poem called the Telegony. It is unclear by whom or when it was composed, but it seems likely that it existed before the 600s BCE, as the author of the Odyssey appears to have known about it and made a connection to the story in the form of an unfulfilled prophecy. An ancient sequel bait, if you will. The Telegony was considered the final part of the epic cycle, a continuation of the Odyssey. It told the story of the missing son of the legendary hero Odysseus with the sea witch Circe, named Telegonus. It also gave a conclusion to the life of Odysseus. Spoiler, he died. I believe a stingray was involved. Effectively, it was the ancient equivalent of The Last Jedi, but people generally liked it. The story ended with Odysseus' body being buried, and a lot of, I guess, not really incestuous, but still kind of weird marriages. The modern fiction author Madeline Miller was inspired by the lost epic and wrote her own book entitled Circe, which attempted to give a general approximation of its plot with her own modern flair. It's a pretty good book, too. If we look more recently, even William Shakespeare has a lost play, or at least a collab he did with someone once that has become lost. A Stationer's Register for the year 1653 attributed a play titled The History of Cardenio to William Shakespeare and John Fletcher. We are told that this particular play was performed by the King's Men, Shakespeare's theater company, in 1613. Not a single word of content from the performance survives, but it was likely an English rendition of the, at the time, popular Spanish novel Don Quixote. There is some debate on if Shakespeare actually was involved, or if his name being attached to it was just a dishonest marketing ploy. 1613 would have been towards the end of his writing career, making it one of his last plays. The reasons for why it became lost are mysterious, but maybe it was simply boring and performed only a limited number of times. Some might have seen it as a cheap cash grab and not worthy to even be remembered. The Book of Bai Se. This ancient Chinese text was essentially an elaborate supernatural manual. It was allegedly penned by the fabled Yellow Emperor all the way back in the 26th century BCE. Just like Berosus, this date of authorship is not possible as China did not have a written language until the 1200s BC, but we'll ignore that for now. The book provided its reader a field guide to all 11,520 types of supernatural creatures that existed in the world, giving descriptions and telling them how to appease, gain favor, and avoid haunting by these spirits. Most intriguing of all is the fact that the book was supposedly dictated to the Yellow Emperor by a talking cow-like spirit named the Bai Se. Only fragments of this being's advice survive in the works of other authors. One of the strangest and most controversial lost works we know about has to be Elephantus's sex manual. You heard me right, an ancient sex manual, and it was a unique text in many ways. For one thing, we know it was penned by a woman, likely a female Greek courtesan going by the pseudonym Elephantus. It was popular for classical sex workers to go by animal names rather than their real ones. The manual was notorious in antiquity as a scandalous and raunchy text, but it appears to have been quite popular despite, or perhaps even because of its negative reputation. A complete set of her works was kept by Emperor Tiberius on his island resort of Capri. Famous figures like Pliny the Elder, Martial, and Galen, to name a few, all apparently read it, so it must have been a relatively widely circulated and popular work. We know that the manual described 9 forms or postures of lovemaking, presumably 9 different sex positions members of the Roman elite could try out. The book even had shameless pictures of the acts. Although many sources view it with disgust, it appears like it wasn't just filled with sex positions, but also gave women legitimate health advice in ways no male writer had done before. Even better, the ancient Dr. Galen noted that Elephantus had included a cure for male pattern baldness in her book. Ooh, let's get some of that. These details suggest that the author was an intelligent health expert of her day, and a female one at that, something that was relatively rare. Alas, such a controversial text was doomed with the coming of Christianity, whose more conservative ideas toward sexuality made the book highly unlikely to survive. The fact that it had hand-drawn illustrations also meant that copying this text was difficult, and the supply was always limited. No doubt many, if not all, of its copies were destroyed around the time of Constantine the Great, and were completely gone by the Middle Ages. Entire libraries. But the saddest thing we have to realize is the fact that there is an untold number of unrecorded books that were written, published, and read for a time, and then promptly lost to history, with no one mentioning them or recording their existence. And consequently, we don't even know their authors, titles, or even what they may have held. And I think that's important. The books I have listed are just the ones we got lucky enough to know about. They represent just a small handful in the massive library of lost books. And we know that throughout history there were libraries, thousands of them, and filled with collections of both recorded and unrecorded books. The vast majority of these libraries met untimely fates, though. The Hellenistic Library of Alexandria, perhaps the largest until the modern era, gets all the attention, but it definitely wasn't the only ancient library that was destroyed along with all its valuable knowledge. The Spanish conquistador Bernal Diaz described Montezuma II, Emperor of the Aztecs, as having a great house for all his books, and managed by a chief librarian. This library, filled with the curious accordion-like books of the Mesoamericans, likely represented the greatest collection of knowledge in the Western Hemisphere at that time. It was unfortunately burned to the ground during the Spanish-Aztec War. The Boxer Rebellion saw the destruction of the Hanlin Academy Library, which had been founded in the 700s CE and remained active for well over 1,000 years. In the fire, irreplaceable Chinese manuscripts and scrolls were lost. Among them was the Yung Lo Ta Ten, or the Yongle Encyclopedia, an 11,000-volume encyclopedia on pretty much everything there was to know, essentially the Wikipedia of its time. Only around 400 volumes managed to survive the burning, accounting for 3.5% of the original work. The rest was lost. One story of loss I found particularly sad. During the 1560s, Catholic inquisitors systematically burned hundreds of priceless Maya codices and scrolls as heresy, claiming they were filled with superstition and lies of the devil. In truth, these documents contained a great wealth of knowledge about Maya culture, science, history, genealogy, astronomy, medicine, and so much more. A Maya priest by the name of Caujo saw this destruction of his people's culture and sought to undermine the colonizers. He began preaching and traveling from community to community, collecting surviving codices and other documents that he could hide from the Spaniards. Unfortunately, in 1568, the colonial government heard of Caujo's resistance movement and sent a military force to eliminate him. In the spring of 1569, a Spanish captain discovered a large temple in the jungle. It turned out to be Caujo's base of operations and contained his entire library of codices. The soldiers burned it to the ground until nothing was left of the books but ash. Such was the fate of so many lost books. But it's not all gloom and doom. There is a glimmer of hope. Sometimes, albeit rarely, what is lost can be found again. There are a handful of texts previously thought to be lost that have since been recovered through archaeology. Most famously was the Gospel of Judas, a blasphemous gospel about Jesus' rogue disciple Judas. It was zealously denounced by the early Christian bishop Irenaeus in the 2nd century CE. His denunciation had the ironic consequence of informing us of the gospel's existence.
Congratulations, you played yourself.
But for almost 2,000 years it was believed that all copies of this heretical book had been destroyed. That was until 2006, when a manuscript copy was discovered among a bundle of books buried near the Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi. To this day, it remains the only copy of this book known in existence. Menander was a celebrated Greek playwright, and was extremely popular in antiquity, but unfortunately most of his comedies did not survive the Middle Ages. Only about 7 of the roughly 80 we know about have survived. One miraculous example is his comedy titled The Girl with Her Hair Cut Short, which was pretty much just an ancient rom-com. So far, the most intact copy we have was preserved on a few scraps of papyrus found in a Roman trash dump. Someone must not have been a big fan of it.
What do you mean? Because it's trash!
We have 40 to 45% of it. More commonly than throwing away unwanted text was the practice by people in the past, especially during the Middle Ages, to reuse and recycle them for new writing material. The Archimedes palimpsest, for example, is a particularly infuriating case study. Archimedes was considered one of the most skilled inventors and scientists in all the ancient world, with many of his inventions and formulas revolutionizing several sectors of ancient industry. His writings would circulate in the Hellenistic era and well into the Roman Empire. After the collapse of the empire, however, the vast majority of his books were lost. We know that at least a couple were literally rubbed out and written over. The Archimedes palimpsest is a document that contains several works of Archimedes that were thought to be lost. At some point in the Middle Ages, these ancient manuscripts were taken to a Christian monastery. The monks at this monastery apparently did not find the teachings of Archimedes interesting enough, as they attempted to erase his words and wrote over them with a religious text. Under the colorful illuminations of Jesus and the apostles are ancient Greek mathematical theorems and diagrams that could have proved very useful for medieval engineers and scientists. A similar thing happened to 2 pages of a copy of the ancient historian Arrian's Events After Alexander, a once detailed account of the successor wars that transpired after the death of Alexander the Great, now lost. The surviving fragments of this work have provided us pieces of information and battle tactics that are found nowhere else in history, which really tantalizingly illustrates how much value was lost with this text. Probably one of the strangest afterlives a lost text has ever taken was that of a speech recorded on papyrus, once given by the Athenian politician Hyperides. The moving war speech was completely unheard of to modern historians, until 1858, when a copy of it was discovered in Egypt, where it had been used to wrap the body of a mummy. The importance of books. If I have learned anything while researching this video, it is that knowledge is fragile, the future uncertain. What is known today and taken for granted may be lost to the sands of time tomorrow. Our modern forms of recording information, such as the internet and digital databases, have revolutionized and solved many of the problems that plagued our ancestors. Bookworms and fires are less of a concern to us now. Copying books is easier and faster than ever. But it would be arrogant for us to believe our modern systems were completely flawless. The preservation of books and knowledge is a constant battle against the forces of the universe, and even ourselves. I think it is a safe bet that not all the books available to our hands this very moment will survive the next 1,000 years. One way or another, rightly or wrongly, some will be forgotten, and in turn be missing to our descendants. Descendants who might wonder what these yet-to-be-lost books might have said. We, like those rich aristocratic Romans, are lucky to have so much knowledge at our fingertips. You never know, you might only have a narrow window to enjoy something before it's gone. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this long video. Sorry about the low output lately. I hope to make more videos this coming year, so yeah, I'll see you around. Since that incident, the rainbow became very careful and decided never again to touch the ground. So now, although he may wish to, no one will ever again be able to reach either ends of the rainbow. This strange look This strange-looking figure appears in the illustration to Book of the Dead spell 17. It is a long and complex spell mentioning many gods, some of them very obscure. The currently accepted view among Egyptologists is that the figure represents Medjed, whose name means the smiter. In the text of the spell we read, "I know the name of that smiter among them, who belongs to the house of Osiris, who shoots with his eye yet is unseen." The fact that only his eyes are shown while the rest of him, except his feet, is covered seems to fit this description. Unfortunately, nothing else is known about this god. John Taylor, Exhibit Curator, British Museum. Okay, make it stop please, this is getting too real. You seriously cannot make this stuff up. I might be a little late to this story, but yes, if you have been on the internet lately, this shape should likely mean, well, something to you. It originates from the popular online game Among Us, where players control crewmates, squat humanoids with no arms, and wearing multicolored hazmat or astronaut suits. These characters have quickly turned into a meme and widespread cultural hysteria on social media. The short of the matter is that people keep on spotting the crewmate shape in real life in seemingly ordinary environments. In trash cans, fire alarms, TV shows, political cartoons, in advertisements, in the split-second transitional frames of animations, in the shape of viruses, and even in ancient wall art and prehistoric figurines. I will admit that I even had a moment like this while walking down the street, seeing a set of empty newspaper boxes and then laughing to myself. They are always there, stalking us, watching us. Well, probably not. Some of these have turned out to be clever photoshops to capitalize on the popularity of the meme. This one, for instance, turned out to be an altered version of the 1,250-year-old Egyptian papyrus of Ani. The rabies virus really doesn't look like this. But the overwhelming majority of these images are seemingly just coincidences. Trash cans and fire alarms were probably not designed with the intent to resemble video game characters. These designs were created this way for underlining reasons of practicality, not to mention their resemblance is superficial at best. And yet, our brains appear to unconsciously recognize the Among Us character in a myriad of unrelated objects we encounter in our daily lives, and have never made these connections before. Why is this? Well, it should first be pointed out that phenomena such as this is nothing new to our species. It's been happening for thousands of years. Not with video game characters, but with cultural icons. Jesus was the original Among Us. People have spotted and still spot his face and body everywhere. From Cheetos to burnt toast to shadows. Dental x-rays, cooking utensils, trees, rocks, dog butts, clouds, tortillas, and even entire nebulas. The Virgin Mary has been seen in chocolate bars and the grease stains of pizzas. It's been happening for such a long time that there's even a name for it in Christianity, archaeopolletos, or made without hand, where icons of religious figures were reportedly made solely through supernatural means and without human intervention. These objects are often claimed to be the work of miracles, and many receive widespread attention, if not outright worship. Famously, a 10-year-old grilled cheese sandwich resembling the Virgin Mary was sold for $28,000 on eBay. My personal favorite is the Nun Bun, a cinnamon roll resembling Mother Teresa, which was stolen from its protective display in 2005, and remains missing to this day. Spotting religious figures in natural and mundane objects isn't a uniquely Christian practice. It is a long-standing and common practice found in many cultures. In Hinduism, images of deities can purportedly manifest themselves through entirely natural means. There is a tree in Singapore whose calluses seemingly look like the monkey god Hanuman, and in 2007 it drew large crowds of pious pilgrims. The shells of Heikegani, a species of Japanese crab, are said to resemble the faces of angry samurai, whose spirits have possessed them, hence their nickname samurai crabs.
Giant enemy crab.
Now, as far as we can tell, just like the Among Us pictures, there was no intention behind these images. They are just our human minds interpreting meaning where there is none, a phenomenon known as pareidolia. Mere tricks of light, shadow, and perspective. In 1976, an eerie human face was spotted on Mars, only for it to be later demonstrated to be the product of several factors. For example, the specific placement of the satellite, the quality of the image, and the time of day. More recent and far more detailed images cause the formation to lose much of its face-like quality. The ridges on the shells of samurai crabs are in truth the product of underlying muscle attachments that result in a pattern that vaguely resembles an angry human face. And the fossil evidence reveals that the backs of these crabs look like this long before humans even evolved faces for it to resemble. As we can see, the human brain is an expert at spotting faces, eyes, and silhouettes, and this appears to be a product of our evolution. Pattern recognition is a very helpful skill for a brain to evolve, even if it does its job a little too well in some circumstances. Primates, including humans, are able to very quickly identify snakes in their immediate environment. Chimpanzees in fact display distinct fear and maybe even hatred of snakes. When they encounter one in the wild, their first instinct is to jump back and sound the alarm. And they do this even when the snake is dead, or a toy, or just a picture of a snake in a book. Some scientists have put forth the snake detection hypothesis to explain this instinctual behavior. Some snakes are venomous and could easily kill an individual if they are accidentally stepped on or touched. As a result, the primate brain evolved to rapidly detect the snake's shape in their environment, and quickly react if that shape were detected in the underbrush. You can never be overly cautious. Being able to detect a face or the eyes of a hungry predator through the dense foliage of a jungle might just save your life. But as we can see, our brains can have a pretty elastic and lenient definition of a face by emphasizing certain details and ignoring others, resulting in pareidolia. I think this is again a product of our evolution. If the face your brain identifies ends up being the calluses of a tree, or a trick of the shadows, what of it? No harm done. Like snake detection, it is better to overreact in a false alarm than underreact when it actually counts. As we go about our day, our brains are constantly searching for possible threats in our environments. One of them being the faces of other humans, who could possibly be enemies wanting to do us harm. Capuchin monkeys, for example, have the ability to identify members of their own group from complete strangers when given a set of pictures, much in the same way we can spot our own family members and friends in a photograph. This trait probably benefited creatures living in a social environment where the quick identification of friends and possible foes was valuable. However, pareidolia does appear to be influenced by culture, as well as instinct. Our brains can be trained to see certain images and make certain interpretations. Most people might see a face in this grilled cheese, but whose face you see is very likely determined by your set of cultural influences. Some people see the Virgin Mary, but other people see Madonna or Marilyn Monroe. Culture is often based around a set of collectively shared symbols that are associated with specific meanings. In Western culture, a guy with a beard and long hair is typically linked with this guy. Perhaps the reason people see the face of Jesus so much in daily life is because his face is one of the most ubiquitous and pervasive images in popular culture. But for other cultures, a bearded man fitting this description has a vastly different meaning. You might see Jesus here, but an ancient Greek might have seen Zeus, or the stereotypical hallmarks of a classical philosopher. And this even works for more abstract images. For most people, this symbol is instantly recognizable and its purpose clearly understood, even without its distinctive lettering. However, the meaning we associate with this shape is not completely universal throughout the world. You might see stop, but a person from another country might just see a red octagon. When this image was taken of one of Saturn's moons, Mimas, a lot of nerds saw it and thought,
"That's no moon. It's a space station."
But someone who maybe hadn't seen a particular 1977 science fiction movie might not have gotten the same interpretation. Perhaps most relevant to our discussion is this symbol. The cross has a very significant meaning to many people around the world, despite it being a relatively simple shape, two lines intersecting one another. Like the face of Jesus, it has been spotted numerous times, an entirely natural phenomena, from images of black holes to the biological structure of proteins, instances that have been claimed to be evidence of divine intervention, a godly signature if you will. Ignoring the fact that a historical Jesus most likely would have been crucified using a cross that resembled an uppercase T, the Roman standard at the time, and not the lowercase t, what this fails to acknowledge is that because the cross is such a simplistic shape, we should of course expect it to occur in nature. When a shape or pattern is so basic, it becomes remarkably easy to see it in the mundane. The infamous webcomic Loss has been reduced to a sequence of horizontal and vertical lines, and as a result, people have since spotted it in everyday phenomena. And I think this is exactly what happened with our little character. The Among Us meme craze has largely broken the symbol down to its base components: 2 legs, a body tinted in either primary or secondary colors, no arms, and a single window-like spot or hole in the center. Our collective brains reduce their already pretty simplified shape so much that we see them everywhere. Many of the popular examples don't even match all the criteria of this base template, but we forgive them for it when they meet not all, but a few of the criteria. And much like Jesus, the ubiquity of the character, made popular by streamers and Let's Players, made it a pretty universally shared and familiar symbol among the culture of the internet. Put them together, mass hysteria. You often see what you want to see, or at least what your culture has trained and influenced your brain to see. And with that, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Trade the Explainer, and I will see you next time, hopefully for a longer installment. Hello there, guys, and welcome back to another installment of Trey Explains the Bible. It's been a while, hasn't it? Today, I've got a video for you guys I've been cooking up. I will discuss 10 and probably more reported intentional changes that have been made to the Bible over the centuries, and what they exactly mean in the context of history. I will also be giving you guys a quick discussion of how the Bible came to us in its modern form. Let me be clear before we start. My job isn't to tell you what these mean to your particular faith, or lack of faith. I'm not here to disprove Christianity or Judaism. My job is to just give you guys the facts and research of biblical scholars and scientists. So without further ado, let's get into it. A few basics about the Bible that you don't commonly hear about. The Bible is perhaps one of the most important texts in history. Composed of the Old and New Testament, it serves as the primary holy book for all of Christianity. The Hebrew Bible, which is composed primarily of what is the Old Testament to Christians, serves as one of the primary holy texts for the Jews. Both Old and New Testaments also serve a lesser role in Islam, the world's second largest religion. About 4 billion people worldwide look to the Bible as the authentic Word of God. The words and verses in these texts have been translated into pretty much every known language surviving today. And the statements and teachings in the Bible affect the judgments of billions. What Moses or what Jesus reportedly said thousands of years ago very much remains significant to a large portion of humanity, from Texas congressmen to Ugandan priests. It is no stretch of the imagination that the words in the Bible can be a matter of life or death to some across the globe. Hello guys, and welcome back to another installment of Trey the Explainer. Hey, let's randomly talk about James Cameron's Avatar, for science. I, for no particular reason, rewatched the 2012 science fiction movie recently, and thought it would be neat to examine what, in my opinion, was the strongest part of the film. Not its acting, not its plot or story, but the creature designs of the aliens of the fictitious planet, or should I say moon, Pandora, in which the film is set. As a person fascinated with biology, zoology, paleontology, and evolution, I found Pandora's life forms absolutely fascinating. And no doubt I felt this way because many of the designs were created by my man, science fiction illustrator Wayne Douglas Barlow, whose amazing work I am well acquainted with, particularly his creation of the speculative field guide for the biology of the fictitious world Darwin 4, The Expedition, which was later adapted into Discovery Channel's Alien Planet, and watched habitually every day by childhood me. Anyhow, I decided to take the time to analyze some of the creatures of Pandora in the same way I did with the races of Game of Thrones, not too long ago, by looking at the information given in the film as an evolutionary biologist would, if these aliens were actually real, and making scientific speculations and models based off of this info, as merely a thought experiment. Yes, I'm doing this under the assumption that evolution exists on Pandora. I know I should expect some Navi young Earth creationists protesting my findings, but please remember, this is just for fun. I will mainly be using images from the film, but also promotional material to draw my conclusions. I know some of this stuff might already be covered in external material like books and stuff, but right now, I'm going in otherwise blind, limited to what is shown in the film of Pandora's zoology. We will be tackling mainly the megafauna of Pandora, animals that appear in the film that are relatively large enough for us to observe and analyze. Alright, let's get to it, Space Marine scientists. Pandora. Before we talk about the creatures of Pandora, we should briefly talk about the moon itself. Pandora is one of the fictional gas giant Polyphemus's moons. It is roughly the size of Earth, though slightly smaller, and the planet it orbits a single star seemingly very similar to our own Sun. Due to the presence of surface liquid water on the moon, Pandora likely exists in the Goldilocks zone. And as a result of this, Pandoran life has evolved very similar to Earth's in the sense that it likely originated in its several large oceans and migrated onto land gradually. Plants, or analogous photosynthetic organisms, exist in wide amounts on Pandora, forming massive jungles, grasslands, and so on. Curiously, they are green in pigment, which further suggests that Pandora's star and atmosphere is very close to our own planetary conditions. Keep in mind, if we were to discover plant-like photosynthetic organisms on other planets, likely they will not always be green in pigment. Plants on Earth are only this green color due to it being the most efficient pigment to absorb the wavelengths of the sun's light that reaches the Earth's surface, typically strongest in the red and blue visible wavelengths. Plants on other planets might be red or blue or infrared in color depending on the stars they get their energy from. The life on Pandora has evolved in addition to plant-like organisms, terrestrial, quote-unquote, animals. I use animals as an analogy because the word animal should really only apply to the multicellular kind of Earth, as these would be wholly unrelated. The animals of Pandora seem to have independently convergently evolved into complex ecological niches analogous to those that have evolved on our planet, with grazing herbivores, scavengers, apex predators, and even domesticated animals by the looks of it. For this reason, multicellular life on Pandora seems old, at the very least a few 100 million years, with a lot of time to evolve organs for specialized tasks, and then reduce them to vestigial remnants or use them for different functions. We'll talk about this later. It is interesting to note that due to Pandora's smaller size and lower gravity, these animals are able to grow taller and larger than animals of Earth, resulting in Pandora's creatures commonly attaining mega sizes. Now, in the film we see that there are more or less 12 different large animal species that make up the ecosystem of the specific jungle habitat, that is the setting. These go as follows: the rhino-like hammerhead titanothere, the pterosaur-like banshee, its whale-sized cousin the great Leonopteryx, the smaller bat-like stingbats, the primate-like Prolemurus, coyote-like viper wolves, the lion-like giant predator Thanator, equid-like dire horse, fan lizard, antelope-like hexapede, buffalo-like sturmbeast, and the sexy blue cat people themselves, the Na'vi. Hexapods. Looking at the creatures of Pandora, it appears that all the large terrestrial animals of this planet are closely related and descend from a shared common ancestor without even making this assumption from the get-go. We can infer this from the body plan of Pandora's megafauna, as all of them with a few scant exceptions possess many of the same physical and morphological traits. Bilateral symmetry, a mouth and head towards the front with an anus and the back towards a tail end, a backbone and internal skeleton of some kind, 6 muscular limbs with digits at their ends, 2 pairs of eyes located on a defined head, a single mouth with teeth, 2 antennae that protrude from the head, and curious nostril-like openings at the base of the neck for respiration or breathing, called in universe operculum. Interestingly, unlike the Earth tetrapods, these Pandoran animals have a respiratory system evolved separately from the digestive system, as opposed to a rather inefficient and dangerous setup where the two are intertwined. I couldn't get much confirmation on the digits in these animals on their hands. The banshees seemingly have 5 digits, while the Na'vi have 4, the viper wolves have 4, and so on. This description fits the majority of Pandoran animals, and it appears that the common ancestor to all these species looked a bit like this: a 6-legged creature with 4 eyes, operculum, a mouth, 2 antennae, and a tail. From this speculative ancestor, the animal species found in modern Pandora evolved and diverged from, modifying and specializing organs and body parts for roles best suited to their ecological niches, just like what happened to our ancestors the tetrapods on Earth. Digits became wings and claws, mouths and teeth evolved to eat meat or plants, and body proportions were scaled up and down to best fit a task. I dubbed this superclass of related species on Pandora Hexapoda, or the hexapods, which simply translates to 6-legged. Now, I'm going to break down these species in separate sections and speculate how these species might have diverged from one another over time, then revisit them to create an overall evolutionary family tree of life for Pandora. Carnivores and herbivores. It seems Pandoran hexapoda can be first split into 2 distinct main groups that diverge from one another early on in development. These are hexapods that evolved to be carnivorous and those that evolved to be herbivorous. Carnivores, like the viper wolf, Thanator, banshee, etc., seem to be more closely related to one another morphologically than herbivores like dire horses, hammerheads, sturmbeasts, hexapedes, and so on. One group evolving to eat plant material and nectar, while the other group specialized to consume this class of plant eaters. This split is again rather similar to what happened more or less in mammals on Earth. Both the herbivores and the carnivores that hunt them on Pandora have convergently evolved remarkably with mammals, hunters evolving claws, teeth, and a lean build for chasing and killing, while the plant eaters evolved strong muscular legs for outwitting their predators, armor plating, living in herds, and even defensive head structures. Titania is the scientific name I'll give the herbivore group of Pandora due to their large size and after James Cameron's Titanic. Based on physiology, I would suggest the sturmbeasts and the hammerheads are closely related to one another than either are to the dire horses. Both sturmbeasts and hammerheads have distinctive head crest structures that probably serve both as defense and sexual display. This is, I think, further clarified by the fact that both sturmbeasts and hammerheads have at least 3 visible toe digits, while the dire horse has possibly only 2 in their hoof-like feet. It appears that just like the horses of Earth, dire horses descend from an ancestor with multiple digits, but subsequently lost these digits, while its closer relatives retain the original tone numbers. The placement of the hexapods on this tree is unclear due to our limited information of this creature. Looking at the toe digits might allow us to tentatively place it on the tree. Xeno, Pterosauria, and Phyllocanidae. On the other carnivorous side of the tree, I suggest the carnivores can be broken up into two, possibly three, we'll get to that later, main groups. Xeno, Pterosauria, which means alien pterosaur, and the Phyllocanids, an amalgamation of the scientific names of cats and dogs. These two groups are best separated by the fact that although they are both predators, Xenopterosauria has evolved wings, while Phyllocanidae has remained completely terrestrial. I speculate that Xenopterosauria consists of banshees, stingbats, and the great Leonopteryx, while Phyllocanidae consists of thanators and viper wolves. Let's break these two groups down further. Phyllocanidae. The thanator and viper wolf appear to be close relatives on account of their very similar body shapes, physical traits, and niches. The thanator has filled a role in the ecosystem akin to the earth lion or tiger, appearing to be mostly solitary, while the viper wolf has filled the role akin to a hyena or coyote or jackal, scavenging and hunting in large cooperative packs to take down prey. A curious thing of note is the fact that the thanator appears to have only a single pair of eyes, as opposed to the typical 4 eyes of most creatures of Pandora. If you look closely, the viper wolf still has a second pair of eyes, like most animals of Pandora, but this pair has been reduced in size, illustrating a possible transitional form between the more basal 4-eyed hexapods and the only 2-eyed thanators. This seems to suggest that the thanator and viper wolf descend from a common ancestor with 4 eyes, but have started to, and in the case of the thanator, fully lost this pair. The reasons for this exactly are unclear. Xenopterosauria is perhaps the most fascinating and interesting of Pandoran life, due to several strange quirks. Banshees, great Leonopteryxes, and stingbats are all superficially similar, and no doubt closer related to one another than to the other animals of Pandora. But if we look closer, they throw us some curveballs. These carnivores fly on 4 large membranous wings, derived from 4 of their ancestors' 6 limbs. The 4 limbs evolved into a pair of massive primary wings, while the second, or perhaps third, evolved into a pair of smaller wings. The last, third pair of limbs remained as talons and feet. This is visible in stingbats and great Leonopteryxes. However, we run into a bit of a problem when we take a deeper look. The makeup of the 4 wings differs between banshees and Leonopteryxes and those of stingbats. Banshees and Leonopteryxes have a forelimb made up of something I will dub a finger fin wing, a very, very unique wing structure made up of several elongated, unconnected digits, while the stingbats seemingly have a more traditional membranous wing closer to the pterosaurs of Earth, where the digits are not part of the wing. This is the possibility to mean many things. Did the wing evolve 2 times independently in these animals, or is the finger fin wing structure an improvement built upon the pre-existing one of the stingbats? I suggest the latter is probably true, with the finger-finned winged banshees and Leonopteryxes being closer related to one another, and the stingbats retaining the relic ancestral wing structure. The finger-finned wings of this clade are very, very unique, as wings in these animals evolve seemingly completely backwards when compared to Earth. Membranous wings on Earth in bats, pterosaurs, other mammals, frogs, etc. evolved from a single plane of webbing between digits, or other structures that grew more and more pronounced over the generations, until the webbing became an entire wing. On Pandora, however, though it appears wings might have initially evolved in this way, this design was improved upon so that the digits themselves individually evolved into long and flat separate digits, fins, that form a complete wing by overlapping with one another. Something that, as far as I know, has never been seen on Earth. Perhaps the closest we have gotten is the feather wings of dinosaurs. One very strange thing to observe is that the banshees only have 4 limbs, primary and secondary wings, unlike all Pandoran life with the exception of the Na'vi. It appears the banshees have lost 1 pair of their limbs, similar to the whales of Earth losing their hind limbs. Both the great Leonopteryx and the stingbats have retained this 3rd pair of non-flight limbs as talons, implying that the trait in banshees is a derived structure rather than an ancestral one. I bet, if we were to look closer at a banshee internally, we might find the vestigial remnants of this 3rd pair of limbs, just as we can find them in whales today. This would further vindicate this hypothesis. Fan lizards. It is unclear where the relatively small reptilian hexapods called the fan lizards fit into this tree. They still have the 6 limbs typical of hexapods, but have evolved a crazy back structure that functions like a helicopter for flight, and to confuse predators. We have very little information on these animals. We don't know if they are carnivorous or herbivorous, so they could exist pretty much anywhere on our speculative hexapod tree, from near the beginning, to on the carnivore side, to even on the herbivorous side. We just don't know. The crazy mess that is the Na'vi. Alright, now on to those dreaded cat people. The Na'vi are perhaps the hardest to fit into our tree in the overall biology of Pandora in general. Unlike all other animals, they have 4 limbs, only 2 eyes, no operculum, no antennae, and so much else non-typical Pandoran life. They are more or less tall, lanky humans with cat ears, eyes, and tails, seemingly tacked on like a Halloween costume. They are so atypical of Pandora and typical of Earth that some have suggested that they aren't even native to Pandora or related to its species, being an alien race that has regressed after landing on this alien planet. Though an interesting theory, I find this unsatisfactory. Obviously, James Cameron and the many other people behind Avatar didn't want the race of creatures we, as the audience, are supposed to relate to and sympathize with the most to look like gross squids or bats or crows or insects like actual aliens would likely look to us, especially if one of these human characters were supposed to have a romance with it. So they designed them to look more or less identical to humans of Earth and appealing to our primate beauty standards, which is likely unlikely for any aliens to evolve in such a manner. Yes, convergent evolution exists and is visible on Pandora, but convergent evolution can only account for so much. The Na'vi, if they are closely related to Pandora's other megafauna, should have the same distinctive 4 eyes and 6 limbs and collar nostrils and so on. But we don't. They are tetrapods with 4 limbs, 2 eyes, and nostrils above their mouths, as well as breasts exactly where humans have ours. I'm sorry, it's incredibly borderline impossible that independent evolution between 2 planets would result in bodies that are so darn close. My personal opinion is that the story would have been more interesting if the Na'vi looked far more alien and animal to us, as they should or would in reality. But that would be implying a weird bestiality tone to the film that some people might want to avoid. Digression aside, based on their morphology alone, the Na'vi appear to be either completely unrelated or only very distantly related to most other Pandoran life, or are related but are an incredibly diverged branch of the hexapod lineage that has evolved to lack many of the quintessential traits typical of Pandoran's hexapods. And there is some evidence for the latter theory. It seems that the Na'vi are closely related to the tree-dwelling Prolemurus. The 6-limbed primate-like Prolemurus could represent a transitional form between the traditional hexapods of Pandora and the very unique tetrapodal body plan of the Na'vi, as the lemurs appear to lack operculum and only have 2 eyes. And this is fitting with the parallel evolution of the Na'vi and humans, both evolving from tree-dwelling primate-like creatures. But if this is the case, what happened to the 3rd pair of limbs in the Na'vi? Maybe, like whales and the tailbones of humans, they have been retained internally as vestigial remnants, like I speculated for the Banshees. If this isn't the case, though, I suggest 2 main models of Na'vi evolution to explain this quirk. Number 1, that somewhere along the line a genetic quirk deleted a part of the Na'vi's body structure. And number 2, possibly that 4 of the Na'vi's limbs fused into a single limb. Theory number 1, gene malfunction. We don't know how Pandoran genetics work, or how these creatures develop in the embryonic stage, but it seems likely that these animals probably have a sequence in their genetic code that maps out where organs are placed in their body. In Earth animals, these genes are called Hox genes, and they are essentially instructions on where to put things during organismal development. They tell the body to put the legs here, or the eyes here, or the anus in the back. Mess with these genes, and they could severely alter the placement of organs on the organism. For instance, there's a ton of horror stories about scientists altering the Hox genes of fruit flies, causing legs to grow where their antennae typically belong, or eyes to form on the kneecaps, or a second thorax and pair of wings. Hope you sleep well tonight knowing this could probably be done on a human if we wanted to. Now, alterations to Hox genes occur very rarely in nature, because it can be very dangerous and overwhelmingly unhelpful to the organism. But it might have happened at the very least once, more on that in a second. Theory number 1 speculates that perhaps through some gene malfunction, likely in something analogous to Hox genes, a part of the body was deleted, and simply did not develop in the embryonic stage of the Na'vi, resulting in the missing pair of limbs. Unlikely as this may seem, weirder things have happened in evolution on Earth. Tardigrades, those strange little water bears, appear to have undergone a rather curious evolutionary path. They are close relatives to arthropods like crustaceans and insects, and on the outside you can see it kind of. However, when geneticists looked at the Hox genes, the genes that created the layout of an organism's body, they found something strange in water bears. The tardigrades are effectively missing a part of their ancestor's body. It turns out that the Hox genes that code for a chunk, a region that corresponds to the entire thorax and most of the abdomen of insects, got deleted in their DNA along the way, resulting in their stumpy, compact body plan. As a result of this, nearly the entire body of tardigrades is effectively just the head region and its insect relatives. Yes, water bears are pretty much heads with legs. Perhaps something happened to the Na'vi with the deletion of limb Hox genes, or a Hox genes for an entire section of the body. And like the water bears, part of their ancestor's body was, quote-unquote, deleted. Theory number 2, limb fusing. My second theory is that the fore and middle limbs seen in the Prolemurus fused into one in the Na'vi. The fusing of several separate limbs together does not seem to have occurred on Earth except as a birth defect called cyrenomyelia, or mermaid syndrome, which is almost always non-advantageous to those it occurs in. So just like the Hox gene alteration deletion, this is rare to persist naturally in the animal kingdom, but it could and be favored by natural selection if such a thing is advantageous in an animal's environment. The reason I bring up this theory as a possibility is mainly because the illustrator who designed the Na'vi has played with the idea before. Wayne Douglas Barlow, in his The Expedition back in 1990, a book filled with speculative alien creatures living on a planet called Darwin IV, and probably a major factor in James Cameron deciding to hire Barlow for the film, gave an alien design called the gyro sprinter, where a quadrupedal animal with 4 limbs initially evolved in a way that caused the front and back pairs of limbs to fuse together into only 2. Perhaps something similar happened to the Na'vi, where the 2 limbs were fused together in a similar manner. I know using this external information is kind of cheating, but it suggests that such a thing is possible in the universe Barlow creates. To determine which theory, if either are correct, we will have to examine the Na'vi's anatomy internally and genetically to better understand this, to see if we find fused bones or abnormal muscles or vestigial limbs or so on. Regardless if these 2 theories or unknown ones are behind the Na'vi's loss of limbs, I suggest the Na'vi possibly originated from the drier savanna lands of Pandora and convergently evolved very similar to humans as a result of this, only to migrate into the jungle regions over time. This speculative xenoprimate branch consists of Prolemurus and the Na'vi, likely splitting off very early on in Hexapoda, before the Titania and carnivore split, losing their second pair of eyes in operculum over time. Conclusion. So after all that, based on my research and speculations, my Pandoran evolutionary tree should look something like this. It's probably wrong, somewhere if not entirely, and keep in mind all this was a neat little thought experiment to test my evolutionary biology skills. I bet you could create many alternative theoretical trees. To truly test this hypothesis, we should further study the internal morphology of these creatures, bones, skeletons, muscles, organs, etc., as well as find genetic evidence and compare them all together to try to solidify this tree, make alterations where needed. And yeah, that is my examination of the native creatures of Avatar from the perspective of an evolutionary biologist. I hope you enjoyed this fun little thought experiment as much as I did. Tell me if you agree with my findings. What do you suggest alternatively? Maybe some of this will be addressed in those other 16 Avatar sequels in development. Man, they better bring back Barlow for these creature designs or I'm gonna riot. Anyways, thanks for watching. And for more biology, anthropology, paleontology, evolution, religion, and science stuff, check out my other videos and make suggestions for future ones. And with that, thank you so much for watching, and have a great day. I hope you learned something new. Call her moonchild, dancing in the shallows of a river. Lonely moonchild, dancing in the shadow of the willow. Talking to the trees of the cobweb strange, sleeping on the steps of a fountain, waving silver wands to the night bird's song, waiting for the sun on the mountain. Hello there, guys. Indiana Jones is so freaking cool.
All around. Prepare to meet Kali in hell.
The fictitious action hero has a special place in my heart as a huge inspiration and just a really awesome protagonist to a really fun and great movie franchise. Playing LEGO Indiana Jones as a kid and marathoning the entire original series back to back to back over weekends, I just honestly really loved how this series captured the spirit of adventure and discovery, and I'm pretty sure many people out there felt the same way. But probably most relevantly to this video, the films and the character himself took the field of archaeology to the mainstream. The quippy and charming Dr. Jones, who we see traveling the globe, fighting Nazis, escaping angry natives equipped with bows and arrows, and excavating tombs filled with skeletons in order to collect gold artifacts, is pretty much the only thing I'm guessing a lot of people know about archaeology and archaeologists. Like, Indiana Jones is one of the top image search results when you type in archaeologist in Google Images, right next to anime and this amazing stock photo guy. And well, now that I'm a cynical old person who has spent a bit of time in the real fields of archaeology and anthropology, I wanted to take a detailed analysis of the character of Indiana Jones through science. Today, I am going to grade Indiana on just how good an archaeologist I think he was, based on the information we see of Indy working in the 3 films, or I guess 4 films. Oh. Is he really the amazing archaeologist the movies claim? Is Indiana Jones a good representation of archaeology? Would his work in the field, if he were real, be respected or revolted? As you can tell from the title, it's a bit of a spoiler. But I'll be using the general knowledge and information I have of the field of study and from talking with and listening to actual archaeology professors and researchers I've met in my experience. I will kind of be judging him primarily by the standards of modern archaeology because that's what is relevant today and what I'm most familiar with. Is that exactly fair? Well, no. It is kind of silly to judge Indiana this way because it is a movie after all and he's just a fictional action hero. But this video is pretty much an excuse for me to educate some people who might be interested in and want to learn more about a subject that I am really passionate about. So don't get your whips all in knots over this, alright? It's just a video for fun and not me criticizing the movies or the fictional character. It's just a speculative video on seeing this character through modern eyes, for the purposes of education. My grading scale will be broken down mainly by the typical divisions of work archaeologists generally do when excavating and understanding archaeological sites and artifacts and compare them to what we see in the films. Alrighty, without further ado, let's get to the video.
You call this archaeology?
Archaeology is one of the 4 major subfields within anthropology, or the study of humans, and in its most simplistic definitions, it is the study and understanding of human activity in the past, through the excavation and examination of sites and artifacts. Now, that being said, archaeology is a very broad field in and of itself. An archaeologist could be researching something as recent as the Civil War, or something as ancient as Mohenjo-Daro or Pompeii, or something as prehistoric as the Neanderthals, or the migration of humans into the Americas. Really, really old stuff, and really, really recent stuff. Egyptologists, scientists that specialize in studying Egyptian history, like to say they are special and distinct from the rest of us, but really they are just a specialized type of archaeologist. It is also important to note that archaeologists are in fact different than paleontologists, who generally deal with far older sites and remains in the tens of millions of years, like the fossils of dinosaurs, though there is some overlap between the two fields within paleoanthropology and paleoarchaeology, or the study of early humans and early human ancestors. Anyways, the job of an archaeologist is to better understand the past of humanity and human cultures for knowledge's sake. That's it. Much of history has been forgotten or faded with time, especially the further back in time we attempt to look. Written and oral records of what humans did can't always be relied upon, or even exist. So, what are we to do? How did humans in the past live? What did they eat or hunt? What tools did they use? What structures did they make? How did they construct them? How did they bury their dead? What did they believe? How are certain cultures related? How did they change or evolve over time? All of these are questions archaeologists ask and attempt to answer with their research of ancient and prehistoric traces of bygone peoples and societies. It's funny to sit in on Indy's lectures in the movies because the brief window of information we see Professor Jones teach about archaeology in his classroom is actually more or less alright. as he seems to generally understand this foundational basis of archaeology as a search for a factual understanding of the past. He even notes a very important thing many archaeologists must learn when conducting research on extinct cultures. Do not make assumptions about your findings. All observations or claims must be supported by evidence. Seriously, just in my previous video I discussed the concept of imposing modern norms and biases on past cultures and the issues that can arise from making claims without necessary evidence. Sometimes, in archaeology, our understandings of past cultures are limited to what is preserved by time, and sometimes we just can't answer mysteries because we simply don't have the evidence. This is especially true of cultural practices, like religious beliefs, where the significance of a practice or an artifact to society was only ever truly known to those who used them in life. Dr. Indiana Jones appears to be largely a historic archaeologist, dealing with sites and artifacts after the advent of writing, roughly anything younger than the 4th millennium BCE. From the films, we see Indy working on sites ranging from pre-Columbian South America to the Middle East during the First Crusades around the 1000 CE, to Egypt in the 980s BCE, to China in the 1600s with the ashes of Nurhaci. Right off the bat, it should be noted that Indiana Jones has an extremely broad interest towards ancient and not-so-ancient cultures. This raises a bit of a red flag. Most archaeologists, and most scientists in fact, are not this diverse, as it is probably better to focus on a particular culture, or period, or region, or technique of interest to maximize your knowledge and impact in understanding that particular aspect of human history. Having broad interest is not a bad thing in the slightest. Just look at me. However, having broad research projects that greatly vary from one another can be somewhat unsmart in science. In a sense, Indiana Jones is likely spreading himself too thin. With such diversity, his published work would be the size of an ocean, but would have the depth of a puddle. Indiana Jones is attempting to research civilizations and cultures vastly separated from one another, both geographically and temporally, over hundreds, if not thousands of years, and entire continents away in fact. Though bold, it is likely unwise, as it would limit his ability to fully understand any of them. I've met archaeologists that specialize in the study of ancient tree rings to determine dates, weather, and environmental patterns. I've met archaeologists that specialize in the study of teeth enamel growth to determine the health of extinct populations. He recently received his PhD just last spring, so congrats to him, by the way. I've met archaeologists that specialize in the study of campfires and Homo erectus in Africa. Weird flex, but okay. Indiana Jones's father, Henry, would probably be more typical of a traditional archaeologist. His interest appears to be largely medieval European history, with a particular focus in the Crusades and the history surrounding the quote-unquote Holy Grail. This is a relatively limited research project that allows Henry to understand a lot of aspects of the same and similar cultures and time periods, giving his research and findings a lot of depth and understanding. Understanding his son would likely not be able to have of his projects due to his wide range. Few archaeologists cover as broad and diverse subjects as Indy, because it's just easier and probably more efficient to specialize your area of research to a limited but broad enough subject matter, like a particular region like Mesoamerica or the Near East or the Ainu culture, rather than jumping all around the world. In the span of 3 years, Indiana goes from studying Indian to South American to ancient Egyptian and Hebrew to medieval Christian artifacts, which is crazy from an academic standpoint. This problem is not something exclusive to Indiana Jones. Most movies and pop culture when depicting scientists and researchers suffer from what I will dub the scientist man problem, where movies portray a single scientist as an expert in literally everything in science. The same scientist that works in biology apparently knows nuclear physics, computer programming and hacking, and how to conduct surgery on a dinosaur. Again, this just isn't the case in real life. Obviously, it would be boring from a movie standpoint if Indiana Jones just showed up in the same locations or dealt with the same artifacts and cultures every single time. But in reality, just know this just isn't realistic. One character describes Indiana Jones as an expert on the occult,
Archaeology, expert on the occult.
which seems to suggest he primarily deals with religious and ritual artifacts. But again, this is rather broad and non-specific. The Ark of the Covenant has pretty much nothing to do with the South American fertility idol, which has pretty much nothing to do with the Holy Grail, which pretty much has nothing to do with the Cross of Coronado. Specializing yourself allows you to dive deeper into your understanding of a culture or a civilization, or an aspect of humans. You simply can't know everything, and when you look at the few times Indiana tries talking about actual historical events, it might explain why he gets details about them wrong. And that's why odds are if Indiana were a modern archaeologist, he would probably be kind of looked down upon as I don't know how to put it, but a poser, if that makes sense. He'd constantly be told to specialize rather than travel around from site to site willy-nilly. Actual archaeologists, both modern and contemporary with Jones, typically spent the same amount of time he spent over the first 3 films researching a single site and location. As we will discuss later, archaeology is very slow and steady, and it takes time to fully appreciate and look over your research, years in fact, if not decades. Another basic problem Indiana has could possibly stem from how he begins his investigations. He typically searches for particular artifacts from folklore and legend, the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant. Archaeologists have sometimes set out to find famous locations or objects or individuals from history, but this doesn't occur as often now. This kind of thinking can be seen as a bit unscientific and working from a preconceived bias, as it often relies on the assumption that these locations or artifacts mentioned in ancient texts or folklore existed in the first place, which may or may not be true. So many archaeologists and God knows how many amateur pseudo-archaeologists in the past and in the present have set out to discover and have claimed to have discovered a lost city or wood from Noah's Ark or some famous king mentioned somewhere, only to find that, no, these remains probably weren't them, and their initial interpretations might have been a rush to judgment due to this confirmation bias, or they straight up found absolutely nothing. Then again, sometimes these searches for specific objects, peoples, and locations mentioned in history have worked. Just look at Caligula's massive sex ships, which were actually discovered and the histories proven accurate. So I guess it all depends. Indiana's method of archaeology is more old-fashioned, so to speak, and I guess fitting with his time period. Archaeologists nowadays tend to find a site first and then attempt to answer questions about it using evidence observed and collected at the site, rather than set out on an actual quest to find something that has been lost. First you find the site, then you start to suspect it might have some historical significance from the evidence, not the other way around, if that makes any sense. But we'll talk about this later in the post-excavation section. Rarely do you look for something famous. The vast majority of archaeology is done on sites, objects, and individuals that are never mentioned in the histories or folklore. A lot of it is just done on absolutely ordinary people and unremarkable daily lives, completely forgotten by history until now. The people looking for Chinggis Khan's tomb or the lost menorah from the Second Temple make up less than 10%, if even that, of archaeologists. You're usually not looking for George Washington. You're looking for the random soldiers on the front lines that died of dysentery. There typically are no maps to them, no descriptions of their glory or beauty, no records of what happened to them. Sometimes the best an archaeologist has is a meager footnote to a name in the margins of some ancient texts, if even that. Prehistoric archaeologists don't even have that luxury. Just understand that Indiana's mindset of searching for a particular famous thing and then finding it would likely be the exception in modern archaeology rather than the rule. It's a rather simplistic, treasure chest, X marks the spot driven starting point, but I guess there's nothing explicitly wrong with it so long as he gets his results in his archaeological site. Modern archaeology, you essentially stumble onto something and then figure out if it has any archaeological or historical significance. I'm giving Dr. Jones a, let's just say, B- in his archaeological basics for his choice of subject matter. Too broad, not specialized enough, though it appears like he, being an apparent super genius, might be able to handle it. Additionally, his mindset could be considered unscientific, but we will go into this later. Pre-field work. Step 1. Finding a site. Alrighty, as we discussed in the prior section, the goal of any archaeologist is to learn about the past. Indiana has chosen an area of interest and has decided to better understand it. But in order for a researcher to do this, they need artifacts, the remains of past cultures and peoples, and to get those, they need to find something called an archaeological site, essentially any location where humans once inhabited and left traces of their activities in. This process can oftentimes be the most arduous and time-consuming of all those in archaeology. Finding the right site to excavate can take years, if not decades, for some people, and can be prone to frequent dead ends, leaving one short of funding and nothing to show for it. The people of the past have left us an absurd number of sites littered all across the landscape, where humans have dwelt, just waiting to be discovered. Most people tend to think of an archaeological site as the large megalithic constructs like the Great Pyramids of Giza, or ancient cities like Pompeii, burial tombs and temples of kings, all locations commonly seen in the Indiana Jones films. However, the vast majority of archaeological sites are rather small, isolated village foundations or buried homes. A site could be something as simple and modest as a single night's campfire where a prehistoric family cooked a meal over. In fact, the glamorous sights of Indiana Jones are the rarity, especially nowadays. Odds are, in the modern day, Indiana would be working with a lot of trash. Literal trash.
I'm the trash man. I come out, I throw trash all over the ring.
Sometimes one of the best ways to find artifacts and learn about a culture is to just look at 1,000-year-old trash piles of bones, shells, flakes, and pot shards, mixed in with dirt and rocks where people discarded their garbage and other waste. The information that can be yielded from these artifacts can be quite shocking and crucial, and literally some crap could mean a breakthrough in understanding a disappeared culture. From human bones, one might be able to date their age, or the diet they consumed in life, or just how they died. From tools and refuse, one might be able to learn the techniques used and implemented by the specific culture. Sometimes literal, pardon my language, shit can be worth as much as something made with gold and diamonds to the archaeologist. As one of my professors said in lecture once, coprolites, fossilized human feces, are a gold mine of information. This is one of the things that many archaeologists during Indiana Jones's day in the real world did not understand, and our knowledge of some cultures has suffered for it. Many of these older archaeologists sought out the treasures, the fabulous opulence of King Tut's tomb, the gold ornaments at the bottom of Lago Guadavita. And after finding these riches, they would scrub them clean and make them ready for display in a museum or in a wealthy man's personal collection, leaving many of the other less shiny artifacts to the wind and rain, or throwing them away once more in the trash. Archaeology is a science, and the only things that should be considered treasures in science are things that help us learn something. You very rarely find treasure in modern archaeology, things that have actual worth outside information and knowledge. In the eyes of the archaeologist, quartz arrowheads, shells, bones, and horribly rusted metals should be just as important as gold idols and chalices. Last Crusade kind of pecks at this concept when it's revealed that the true quote-unquote Holy Grail from the Last Supper is a rather drab potter's cup, rather than the bejeweled giant metal goblets that it shares the room with. The treasures of modern archaeology are well-preserved fossil remains like Sediba, Alidi, Lucy, and the Tong Child, the stomach contents of Otzi, the skeletal remains of a dwarf in a completely ordinary Byzantine cemetery, the microscopic pollen grains on hammerstones, the ring sequences of long petrified trees, DNA traces of typhus in the tooth enamel of the remains of Napoleonic soldiers. Again, not because they are shiny or pretty, but because they provide us a rare understanding of something that was previously not understood, however big or small. Unfortunately, this is not something Indiana seems to understand for the most part, just like many of his real contemporaries. And that's sad. Finding sites, and by proxy these much-to-be-desired artifacts, can be devilishly difficult despite their frequency. Hundreds, if not thousands of years have passed since they were abandoned, and consequently, the land has swallowed them back up beneath the layers of sediment, foliage, and even entire sea levels. Just finding the right place to start can be downright impossible. Rarely are there maps or directions as shown sometimes in Indiana Jones. This is why archaeologists have developed countless survey methods that help one pinpoint a site buried by time. Hints can be found in the soil and vegetation. Aerial survey methods, such as photos taken of the land from planes, kites, and more recently drones, are one of the most common and most efficient ways to find a site over a large area, as these can discover the foundations of buildings through crop marks and similar features. A relatively new technology called LiDAR, or light detection and ranging, uses lasers to penetrate through dense tree foliage and detect structures and shapes hidden beneath jungles and forests. However, if you are restricted by the ground, an archaeologist might be forced to use ground-surveyed methods. Technologies like ground-penetrating radar, electrical resistivity, and magnetometry are all used by archaeologists on the ground to cut through dirt and soil, and hopefully discover a hidden site just waiting to be excavated. Indiana, however, lacking many of these technological advancements due to this time period, has been limited to what all archaeologists had to do back in the olden days. A gumshoe survey. Dun dun dun. Which essentially is a survey method that relies largely on luck, charisma, happenstance, hard determination, and a lot of waiting. A gumshoe survey often involves hanging around a region for a while and talking to locals and natives for information or leads. They've lived there longer than you and probably know more about the land than you. Maybe an arrowhead was discovered by some kid buried in the forest, and maybe he could lead you back to where he found it. Or a farmer keeps finding these strange metal trinkets whenever he tills his field. Don't trust them 100% all the time, but definitely look into these leads and pursue them if possible. Waterways like rivers could be a good place to start, as humans are largely drawn to and depend on water to survive. And yes, sometimes just researching the past of a region could yield results. Old maps, notes, descriptions, traditions can all lead to the discovery of an unknown site. Heck, collaborate with other archaeologists, anthropologists, geologists, historians, miners, and even just the old lady that lives down the block. Seriously, really anything can help you when you're starting with essentially nothing. Judging from the movies, this appears to be where Indy really excels. Throughout the films, Indiana Jones shows an unbelievable skill at survey methods, particularly the gumshoe survey. Indy is really good at making friends and socializing, extremely good in fact. He knows several languages and is able to speak to locals and natives to regions, and he seems like he's able to get a lot of information from them, especially the locations of archaeological sites and artifacts, which is really good, to the point the man is a pro at it. He also seems adept at his research of a region's history, finding accurate maps, descriptions, and traditions, and using them for his benefit of locating sites. And yeah, definitely use the research of prior archaeologists. Of course, credit and cite them in your publications, though. Yeah, use that staff of Ra so long as it gets you there in the end, I guess. This suggests Indy spends hours upon hours at a time off-screen at the library, just researching and reading back at home, which is really good. And Indy's got the archaeological sites to show for it, contributing to the discovery of, more or less with the help of countless other individuals, 5-ish sites over the course of the original 3 movies, some off-screen, which is pretty darn impressive. His survey methods are almost 100%, goddammit, considering all the survey attempts we've seen of him are successful in locating sites. That's unheard of, dude. Most archaeologists are down to like 40%. I'd suggest he just be a surveyor for hire for other archaeologists, because he'd make a killing with that kind of success rate. One thing that should be noted is that archaeologists should not have quote-unquote rivals, which is what Indiana refers to his fellow archaeologist Dr. Belloc as. Granted, Belloc is a massive jerkhole and murderer, but regardless, this type of thinking is bad and unscientific to say the least. Archaeologists should be open to working together, and probably should desire it. Science works better when it's collaborative, and when differences between nations, creeds, religions, and even just egos are removed from those conducting it. That's how things get sloppy, damaged, lost, destroyed, or worst, left unpublished. Don't have rivals. Work together for the sake of knowledge. A-. Indiana does his research and survey methods, and he's really freaking good at it. Papers, please. Finding a site is one thing, getting to excavate there is another. First things first is you gotta register your site under a large catalog database, giving it a unique identifier to distinguish your site from all the other thousands of sites out there. In the US, this would be a Smithsonian number, or Smithsonian trinomial, which is a sequence of letters and numbers that denote specific details about your unique site, the state and county in which it was discovered, and the number order your discovery is in relation to all the other sites discovered in that county. If the site you discover was in Ohio and in Morgan County, and it's the 59th site discovered in Morgan County, your Smithsonian trinomial should look like this: 33 MG 59. Like I said, very bureaucratic, but helpful to standardizing naming processes, and helps prevent mix-ups when talking about one site over another site. All American archaeological sites must have Smithsonian trinomials, big and small, famous and not so famous. 29 CX1, 33 WA2, 9 SN 2220, 45 BN 52. This will be your site's quote-unquote name, and would most likely be what you and others will refer to it as from now on. If your site is special enough, though, yielding something of unique insight or information, it might be called by a common shorthand nickname of some kind. Site 26NY301 is one literally anybody who has taken an archaeology class in a college in the United States has heard of. Its more common name is the Gatecliff Rock Shelter, and it's used in pretty much every, and I mean every, American archaeology textbook, namely because its discoverers wrote said textbook. In other countries, the naming process can vary, but most of the time it involves an alphabetical and numerical sequence that conveys the region of the site and its number in relation to previously discovered sites. Yes, it's annoying paperwork, but it's necessary in science to avoid confusion. Fossils, artifacts, and so on all get unique identifier numbers, just so you know what's referring to what. Now, most people get this image of an archaeological site being an obscure, isolated plot of land in the middle of a desert or jungle, totally abandoned and forgotten by humans. However, quite the opposite is often the case. A lot of times, over the centuries and millenniums, people have built directly on top of sites without even knowing it. Farms, crop fields, houses, walls, wells, schools, office buildings, highways, and all that. The tomb of King Richard III was under a parking lot. And a lot of times, this close proximity to current human habitation is how a site is discovered. We actually see this in Indiana Jones, The Last Crusade, as the tomb of a crusader, as well as various other catacombs, are directly beneath a modern Venetian library. Nowadays, an archaeological site is almost always on someone's property, and therefore, at least within United States law, falls under the possession of the current property owner, if this be the government, the bank, or just Joe. And because we live in a bureaucratic time, that means a lot of paperwork before you even start digging. Ownership can get messy, to say the least, but it is important. As an archaeologist, you're going to have to talk to these property owners and get their consent to go on their property and excavate a site. And sometimes people just won't even give you permission, and you have to stop there, as much as that sucks. Many states have advice for property owners, urging them to allow archaeologists to come and examine a site if they do discover one. However, if the property is private and the owners do not give their consent, well, tough luck, Indy. You're trespassing, and that's illegal. Certain circumstances, one might be able to sue for the right to excavate if this site is of crucial scientific importance, but it's a bit of a gamble and up to the courts. Or you could buy it off somebody. Federal and government land can be a bit different. Almost always, archaeologists employed by the government will be allowed to excavate. However, due to the Native American Graves Protection and Reparation Act, this must be done sensitively and respectfully with regard to those surviving descendants of whatever Native American or Native Hawaiian culture is closest related to the peoples associated with the site and artifacts. After excavation, the artifacts and remains belong to said descendants, and they have the right to decide if archaeologists can further study these objects, and if they refuse, sorry, you have to end there. Some might disagree with this idea, and even still to this day the concept is controversial. However, one must keep in mind the colonialism and, well, yes, racism associated with the study of archaeology, and the blurred lines between grave robbing and looting a colonized culture and researching a colonized culture that has transpired throughout history, especially during ARC's early days. Who knows how many Native American graves were dug up, and the bones of the individuals buried there, smashed and destroyed, or kept collecting dust on shelves in the museum collections in the name of archaeology. All this being done with complete disregard to the religious and cultural beliefs, and just plain level of respect for the cultures they belong to. Though there is no formal law, the general unsaid rule of thumb is that if there is a surviving descendant or closely related culture that can be found claiming ownership, they should probably have ownership over a site and its artifacts if they can be verified. And this is done mainly not for scientific purposes, but for the sole purpose of being decent and courteous. Because sometimes you gotta ask yourself, is it really worth it? Is the information worth desecrating a burial plot or damaging the preservation? And yes, this can be incredibly gray, as I've already examined in a previous video. Everything should be looked at on a case-to-case basis. And keep in mind, this does not always mean a site and artifacts can't be excavated or researched. You just have to ask permission first. In most countries outside the US, archaeological remains become the property of the country where they were found, if both no private owners or descendants can be verified, and this is regardless of who finds them. In Egypt, archaeological sites are often sponsored by international universities and research teams. Notably, these teams must obtain permission from the Egyptian government to dig at the sites, and all artifacts become the property of the Egyptian government, which allows the archaeologist to examine, research, and test. If all else fails, just communicate with the owners, whoever they might be, indigenous descendants, private property owners, or government bodies. Most of the time people will eventually recognize the scientific value of something and give permission. Sometimes owners just want something as simple as acknowledgments for their contribution to the discovery, just a level of respect. So, generally, if your site is on someone's property, just ask, get their permission in writing, with signatures, just be respectful and sensitive. Without this permission, you're not an archaeologist. You might be a thief or a grave robber. Now, does Indiana Jones follow any of this? Heck no, he doesn't. We never really get any evidence that Indiana Jones asks for permission to excavate sites from private property owners, the governments of the countries he enters, or even goes through any kind of site registration process. both for large, abandoned, and isolated sites that probably don't belong under someone's direct private property, as well as sites close to developed areas and likely falling under someone's private property. Indiana Jones does not like doing paperwork, so it seems. Chartalal, a villain in the Temple of Doom, appears to reference at the very least 2 off-screen instances where Indiana Jones' archaeological antics drew the attention of government bodies. Once in Honduras, where he was said to have been more of a grave robber than an archaeologist, and another in Madagascar, where a king banned him from the country indefinitely and threatened to remove his, if he ever returned. And yes, this guy is the antagonist and sacrifices children and has clear dislike towards Dr. Jones from the get-go, but Indiana appears to even acknowledge the validity of his criticisms. And as we will discuss in a second, we have first-hand visual evidence of Indiana's unethical methods. Is Indiana Jones a grave robber? The big question I bet that everybody is asking. Indiana Jones is probably a grave robber. George Lucas admits as much himself. Indy's sites. Indy does not get permission to excavate the majority, if any, of his sites as far as we know. And yes, he's almost notorious for not getting permission to the point people accuse him of grave robbing in the films. The Tomb of the Crusader in Venice is a great example of this. A modern library has been built directly over the tomb, and rather than notify any archaeological organization, the Italian government, or even the library staff itself, Indiana goes straight in and begins excavating on the spot, damaging a section of the library in the process. Needless to say, this is very unethical and totally against the normal procedures of archaeology presented above. He doesn't get permission to excavate in Egypt, or in the Republic of Atea, or elsewhere. Heck, there's a freaking scene where the Nazis of all people asked for permission to excavate the Grail from the Republic of Atea's borders.
We would not think of crossing your soil without your permission, nor of removing the Grail from your borders without suitable compensation.
Sure, they essentially pay off the Sultan of a country to get permission to excavate, but it sure is heck more than anything Indy ever does. I can't believe I'm saying this, but, Nazis 1, Indiana 0. Oh gosh. Another curious thing to note is that not all of Indiana Jones's sites are abandoned per se. Particularly the Thuggee Temple in Doom, the Jovito Temple in Raiders, the Crystal Skull Valley City in Kingdom, and yes, technically the Grail Temple in Last Crusade, remember that 900-year-old knight, are all continuously inhabited sites and arguably not archaeological because, well, people still live there. It would be like an archaeologist breaking into the Vatican and stealing a whole bunch of tapestries and paintings and golden chalices. You just can't do that. Note, I have a friend that is stolen from the Vatican gift shop, so she knows who she is. Indiana's exploration of these sites because of this is not the work of an archaeologist. This is probably more of a job for a cultural anthropologist, a person who studies extant living cultures, and not an archaeologist who studies past ones. And even so, he'd still have to ask for permission. In all the above circumstances, the sites and therefore the artifacts at them belong to the current owners of the sites, who can claim descent from their founders. This is especially true for sites in the Americas, where Native American relations with archaeologists can be tenuous. The golden idol that starts off the series probably should belong to the Jovitos, who value it as a religious and or cultural object of importance, and obviously did not give Indy permission to excavate it. Out of the artifacts, the Ark of the Covenant by modern procedures would belong to the Egyptian government, rather than the United States, and woof would that cause a geopolitical nightmare. The Holy Grail has no surviving cultures who can really claim it besides the Grail Knight maybe, so maybe take it up with him? Or the Hittite government. The Golden Idol and Shankara stones should probably belong to Ovitos and Small Town respectively, as they are the surviving descendant cultures. And to his credit, Indiana Jones does do this once at the end of Temple of Doom, where he decides that it's probably not worth it to steal the Shankara stones for science, and gives them back to their respective descendant cultures, which is really good. There you go, that's a point there for Indiana Jones. If Indiana were an archaeologist today, he would probably need the express permission of the Grail Knight, the Jovitos, the Thuggees, the Crystal Skull natives, and probably whoever Indiana upset in Honduras and Madagascar. And heck, he should probably ask those librarians. I'm just picturing Indy trying to get signatures and permission slips from some of these guys. Excuse me? I know you're a 900-year-old man who probably should not even understand my vastly diverged dialect of English, but could you please sign this waiver giving me permission to excavate your property? I see you're pulling the heart out of a man, but Molaram, do you mind if I look at the artifacts from my research paper? Needless to say, Indiana's lack of care for permissions and property ownership would probably get him arrested by governments and disowned by the archaeological community of today. By not following these typical site procedures in respects of ownership, Indiana Jones would effectively be no different than the grave robbers in Syria that are still to this day plundering and destroying ancient sites for artifacts and selling them on the black market. And it's kind of bad when the Nazis are taking the more legitimate paths of archaeology than you are. Just ask for permission, Indy. You have a wealthy American university backing you that could probably set something up. Oh yeah. Also, he didn't even bother to create any frickin' Smithsonian numbers. Shame, Indy, shame. No catalog number? How are we going to identify your site in the database from all the other crescent moon-shaped canyons and Jovito temples? Bad. D. Indy's site can be poor choices sometimes, arguably not archaeological. Never secures permission to excavate and therefore illegal. His findings would likely be useless and unusable to the scientific community. Okay, so this is a monster of a video already, so I hope you enjoyed it so far, because I'm going to split this in 2 parts. Hope you enjoyed. This has been kind of fun for me to research, and yeah, it's been kind of awesome rewatching those Indiana Jones movies. Stay tuned for the next episode where we finally get to excavation and analysis, and see if Indiana's score as an archaeologist gets better or worse. Thanks for watching. End of Part 1. In olden days, a glimpse of stocking was looked on as something shocking, but heaven knows anything goes. But good authors too, who once knew better words, now only use 4-letter words, writing prose. Anything goes. The Statue of Liberty overlooking New York City is without a doubt one of the most recognizable statues in the world. Though scarcely the tallest out there, Wikipedia lists her 49th, there's still something striking about this giant green lady holding a torch high above her head. Lady Liberty, as she is often called, was made in the likeness of Libertas, a Roman goddess representing freedom to the people, and since her construction she has become a major symbol of the American spirit. But what if I were to tell you that she is an imitation of another statue, thousands of years older, and considered just as grand, if not more so? Lady Liberty has often been given the moniker the New Colossus, as a bronze plaque mounted at her base proclaims. There was once an old Colossus, the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land. What is the story behind this old Colossus? Where did it stand? Who built it and why? And what happened to it? Hello there guys, and welcome to another installment of Trey the Explainer. I have always been captivated with the idea of the tourist trap, or roadside attraction, sites and landmarks that seem to draw people from far and wide to visit them. In our age of fast cars, interconnected highways, and airports, it might be easy to think that tourism is a product of the modern age, when in fact it has existed for thousands of years. People in antiquity had their own frequent vacation hotspots. I wanted to make a video or two highlighting a few of these ancient tourist traps, as I like to call them. Today, I will discuss my personal favorite, and uncover the complicated and sometimes mysterious history behind the last wonder of the ancient world, the Colossus of Rhodes. The word colossus in modern English has become synonymous with structures or creatures on a massive towering scale. The word originates from the Greek kolossos, which appears to derive itself from a Proto-Greek word that was used to refer to statues, oddly enough statues both big and small, a figure or puppet representing something absent. But at some point the word was almost completely redefined so that it only referred to statues of immense size. Ancient accounts tell us that this was the result of one truly monumental construction project that occurred around 300 years before Jesus. The Siege. The year was 304 BCE. The colored sails of 1,000 warships were disappearing over the horizon. The bright and sunny merchant city of Rhodes, on its spearhead-shaped island in the South Aegean Sea, had been freed after an entire year of constant fighting. In the succession wars that followed the death of Alexander III, better known to us as Alexander the Great, the Rhodians had favored neutrality. They had refused to aid one general turned king over another, in their squabbles over Alexander's quickly fragmenting empire. Wars were bad for trade after all, and the wealthy elite of the port city that linked Greece to the Middle East and Egypt thought it best to stay out of the conflict altogether, as their separate but impartial entity. This act had earned them the scorn of 77-year-old Macedonian Antigonus One-Eye, the newly proclaimed rightful king of Alexander's crumbling empire. He had dispatched his son and heir, the 32-year-old Demetrius, known as the Taker of Cities, to persuade the insubordinate Rhodians to his cause. He needed them for his upcoming invasion of Egypt, ruled by the shrewd rival king Ptolemy in Alexandria. The Rhodians had refused his offer, and Demetrius would repay them in blood. In 305 BCE, he gathered a massive fleet to take the island by force, enlisting the help of the thousands of pirates who prowled the seas, promising them gold and plunder once the cities had been taken. With 200 warships and supposedly 5 times as many private pirate vessels following behind, an estimated 40,000 soldiers set out to conquer Rhodes for Demetrius and his father, expecting an easy victory. Demetrius constructed great weapons to break Rhodes' high walls. He set his engineers to build battering rams 180 feet long and taking 1,000 men to push. Massive wheeled siege towers called city takers, 6 stories high and requiring over 3,000 men to operate. The defenders of the city numbered 7,000 compared to the invaders' tens of thousands, but the Rhodians had the advantage of heavily fortified walls, and they fought for their homes and families. They would not yield so easily. Using a mix of cunning and sheer willpower, the Rhodians had resisted for an entire year against their invader, humiliating him in the process. Many brave men had died fighting to save their home, but for every man killed defending the city, many more had been killed trying to take it, to no avail. Many of Demetrius's pirate mercenaries had begun to melt away back to the waters from which they came from, seeing his war a fruitless venture. Growing ever more unpopular by the day, and with instability back at home, Demetrius signed a peace agreement with Rhodes in 304 BCE, lifting the siege and departing along with his defeated grand army back to the Greek mainland. And with that, the Taker of Cities left at least one city untaken. As part of the agreement, Demetrius had abandoned all his valuable siege equipment and weapons in the dirt surrounding the city. This act was no small thing, as the city melted all that metal down and sold it for a total of 300 talents, or by modern estimates approximately 360 million US dollars, leaving the Rhodians not only free of foreign rule, but also significantly richer. Instead of using this money to, feed the poor and needy, the Rhodian elite decided the best way to use it was to build a giant statue of a naked dude. Well, not a dude, but a god. The patron deity of Rhodes was Helios, riding his flaming horse-drawn chariot across the sky. He was the personification of the sun itself, bright, radiant, and handsome, guardian of oaths and bringer of sight, and the city of Rhodes was one of the few locations in ancient Greece where he was considered a major god. Native Rhodians held particular reverence for him, perhaps stemming from their island's reputation for clear skies and a bright sun. Many of the city's inhabitants believed it was his hand that had miraculously delivered them through the grueling siege. They would construct the largest statue ever made, one to surpass the great statue of Zeus at Olympia, or the ivory and gold statue of Athena at the Parthenon. Standing taller and shining brighter, their Helios would prove to the rest of Greece that their god was a force to be reckoned with. The Rhodians had looked to one of their own to build something on such a monumental scale. They chose the sculptor Charles of Lindos, a native of the island who might have even fought on the city's fortified walls during the siege. Charles had been a pupil of Lysippus. Self-taught Lysippus was considered one of the most skilled artists of the age. According to Pliny the Elder, over his 90 years of life, Lysippus produced over 1,500 sculptures, working almost exclusively in bronze. Unfortunately, little of his work survives today. The victorious youth statue was snagged in the nets of an Italian fishing trawler in 1964, after being submerged underwater in a shipwreck for over 2,000 years. Due to its age and style, the statue has been attributed to Lysippus, perhaps the only one of his original bronzes that have endured through the centuries. Many Roman copies of his work recreated in marble are housed in museums all over the world, such as the Scrapper, the Oil Pourer, the Farnese, Hercules, and Eros stringing the bow, among others. Lysippus was praised for his elegance and grace, constructing lean figures with proportionally smaller heads, which gave the illusion that they were much taller than they really were. It was this skill that convinced Alexander the Great to deem Lysippus the only artist worthy of capturing his likeness, serving as his personal sculptor, and supposedly always depicting him with a particularly famous pose, now called the Lysipian gaze. Tousled hair, lips slightly parted, head and eyes tilted upward as if gazing up at the gods. Charles of Lindos learned much from his master and had proven himself worthy of the task. The Helios of Rhodes would be considered his magnum opus, the crowning achievement of his entire life. Exact details concerning the construction itself are scarce. As we will discuss later, most of our sources on the matter were authors writing decades, if not centuries, after the fact. We know that the Colossus of Rhodes, as it would one day be called, was to be made of the same material Charles had primarily worked with, bronze, with maybe a little bit of copper mixed in. Some of these materials were likely repurposed directly from the Macedonian siege weapons left behind by Demetrius over a decade prior. The great siege towers themselves might have been used as scaffolding for workers to clamber up during the project. It was decided that Helios would stand 70 cubits. Unfortunately, this unit of measurement varied throughout the ancient world, but a rough estimate puts it around 33 meters, or 108 feet. Just shy of the height of the Statue of Liberty herself, not counting her podium. This would create a challenge, as most bronzes of the period were cast in a mold, but for a statue as big as the Colossus, this was not a feasible option. It was devised by Charles that the exterior skin of the statue would be composed of dozens of large sheets or plates of hammered bronze, riveted together. Underneath would be a framework of iron bars providing the statue its shape. Pliny the Elder many centuries later tells us that this inner framework was filled with heavy stones and boulders to keep the entire structure from falling over. Underneath it all would be a large, circular pedestal, which the statue would stand on top of. The exact size of this pedestal is unclear. Some sources say it was 15 feet tall, while others say it was 15 meters. Moving this large quarried piece of marble or sandstone was likely the first step in the long construction process that finally started in the year 292 BCE. One theory suggests that an earthen mound was built up around the statue's location and was used as a ramp. Little by little, dirt was removed from Helios's body, weirdly being built from the top down. It would take a long 12 years worth of hard, sweaty labor, and likely, by modern estimates, many millions of dollars to complete. Sadly, it is believed that Charles did not live to see his Colossus's completion. Several legends say that he committed suicide. As one story tells it, as the statue neared its finalization, someone had ominously pointed out a small architectural flaw that had been overlooked. After it was brought to the attention of Charles, he killed himself in shame. Another story claims that the sculptor was driven into bankruptcy due to the vast amount of building materials required, and ended his life to escape his debts. Whatever the truth is, no one can doubt that it must have been a stressful job for one man to have held on his shoulders. Nonetheless, one morning in 280 BCE, as the sun rose to illuminate the dark landscape, a figure stood tall and alone over Rhodes, gleaming back at the great ball of light in the sky. All the dirt and scaffolding that had hidden it for so long was finally removed. A huge crowd of many thousands gathered to celebrate the completion of the Colossus of Rhodes, the largest statue in the known world. A poet shouted beneath its towering body a dedication. To you, O sun, the people of Dorian Rhodes set up this bronze statue reaching to Olympus. When they had pacified the waves of war and crowned the city with the spoils taken from the enemy, not only over the seas, but also on land did they kindle this lovely torch of freedom and independence. For to the descendants of Heracles belongs dominion over sea and land. One can only picture the uproar of applause and celebration that ensued. What did this great Colossus look like exactly? Well, believe it or not, rather mysteriously, we don't really have a good idea, as not a single part of it survives to this day. Additionally, there appears to be no contemporary descriptions of the statue, or at least not ones that are incredibly detailed. Our surviving ancient sources are few and far between, and have much to be desired. Perhaps our most reliable account of the statue comes from the early geographer Strabo. Strabo was from the region of Pontus, modern-day Turkey, and lived from about 64 BCE to 24 CE. He spent the majority of his life exploring and chronicling the lands he visited, going as far south as Egypt and Ethiopia, and as far west as Tuscany and Italy. And perhaps most impressively, he survived the journey back home to Tel Aviv, a feat very few men could boast at the time. A trip to Rhodes, by comparison, would have been a walk in the park. Strabo visited the city sometime in the latter part of the 1st century BCE, which places him there almost 200 years after the Colossus had collapsed. He describes in his geography seeing the statue greatly damaged, broken at the knees, and lying on the ground, but gives no further details. Our other main source comes from Pliny the Elder, a famous Roman historian who might have been born in the same year Strabo had died, and met his unlucky end in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in the year 79 CE. Pliny briefly describes the Colossus in his work The Natural History. As a warning, however, he wrote it even more removed from the time it stood, over 300 years, and to make things worse, Pliny never visited Rhodes himself, instead basing his descriptions of the city and the Colossus on second-hand eyewitness reports. Pliny narrates a scene very much in agreement with Strabo, a gigantic heap of rubble that even in its sorry state was a sight to behold. The wreck had become a popular tourist attraction for travelers to visit. Few men can clasp the thumb in their arms, and its fingers are larger than most statues. The last ancient source available to us is the dubious Philo of Byzantium, whose very existence is somewhat contested. Philo was a Greek mechanist or engineer who had lived sometime in the latter half of the 3rd century BCE. He is not to be confused with another writer also named Philo of Byzantium who lived at a much later date and is credited with creating the list of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Colossus named among them. Of importance to us, this 3rd century BCE Philo might have actually seen the statue in its heyday, but yet again his descriptions are vague. Ugh. Needless to say, all our sources are largely unhelpful in getting a good idea of what the statue might have looked like while it still stood intact. The dedication poem supposedly read at the Colossus's unveiling has survived the ages, and some have used a few lines in this poem to infer details about the statue itself. For instance, if you Google the Colossus of Rhodes, the majority of the image results will depict the infamous straddling the harbor pose. Helios's legs spread far apart over the entrance of the Rhodian harbor, allowing ships to pass beneath it. You might find it surprising to discover that this image solely originates from the line over land and sea in the dedication poem, which some have extrapolated to suggest the statue stood with one foot on either side of the harbor. As spectacular a sight as this sounds, it is flat out incorrect. In addition to it not being scientifically or structurally feasible or practical by any of the standards of the time, this straddling pose is not supported by any of our other ancient accounts, and the evidence for it is incredibly tenuous at best. The poetic line likely refers not to the statue itself, but to the victory of the Rhodians in the war, proclaiming they had dominion over sea and land, presumably through their naval fleet, the sea, and their army, the land. The only reason the straddling pose has gained such prominence is because of an Italian visitor to Rhodes in 1395 hearing a local legend, almost 2,000 years after the fact. This legend stated the Church of St. John stood where the right foot of the Colossus once did. This myth was repeated over and over again throughout medieval and Renaissance Europe, through a weird game of telephone. It captured the imaginations of countless artists, who then depicted the statue in this manner. William Shakespeare alludes to the pose several times in his plays, and Spanish and Dutch missionaries carried this inaccurate image of the Colossus with them when they traveled to China and Japan. Versions of it, with their own cultural flair, bizarrely ended up in Asian books on Europe's ancient history. Many images also depict the statue holding a flaming torch high into the air, like the modern Statue of Liberty. But this idea, again, has little to no historical basis. The torch claim originates with 2 vague descriptions of the Colossus, one once again coming from the dedication poem. They kindle the lovely torch of freedom and independence. The other stemming from Philo of Byzantium's claim that Charles of Lindos gave a second son to the world. Both these lines are likely no more than metaphors that have been misinterpreted. The poetic line likely refers to the Rhodians freeing themselves from foreign rule and rekindling the symbolic torch of freedom, not necessarily saying the statue itself held a torch. Philo's claim is probably just an analogy, equating the grand statue of Helios to the real Helios, the sun itself. After all, the statue's bronze skin would have gleamed bright in the sunlight. Much like the straddling pose, our ancient accounts give no indication of this proposed torch. Other mythical claims include a winding staircase running to the statue's top. Visitors could climb it to a viewing stand with intricate glasses hung on the statue's neck that would allow a person to see the coast of Egypt and Syria hundreds of miles away. An interesting, but entirely impossible feat. But if the Colossus didn't look like this or this, what then was the most plausible appearance of the statue? Archaeological excavations of the ancient city have offered up some answers, but it should be clarified that much of this is largely based on speculation and disconnected pieces of evidence. First off, we have a pretty strong idea of what Helios's head would have looked like, at least. Countless silver coins in the city of Rhodes, dated to be contemporary with the Colossus, might hint at the statue's appearance. These coins typically have one side bearing a rose and one side bearing a face, the face of the god Helios, both considered symbols of the Rhoidian people. These coins were likely minted after the statue's completion, and perhaps the face of Helios on the coinage is the same one that was on the Colossus. Such a practice was not uncommon in the ancient world. Many cities created their own unique coins and used popular elements of the region to distinguish themselves. Taking great pride in their local legends and attractions, they frequently sought to incorporate these images into their coinage. For example, Alexandrian coins sometimes depict their famous lighthouse of Alexandria. Cretan coins bear the fabled labyrinth of Knossos, or the Minotaur flexing, in reference to their legendary heritage. These images were part of their very identity as a people. Also, it's almost like they were trying to promote tourism to their respective cities by hyping them up a bit. Coins like these could travel far and wide, and be easily exchanged between dozens if not hundreds of people. A sailor from Rome might hold in his pocket coins from Jerusalem, Carthage, and Alexandria, and they could have worked almost like the ancient equivalent of postcards, the coins carrying tales and stories of the cities they originated from. If this theory holds true, then the head of the Colossus would have looked much like this: a beardless youth with long curly hair, bright eyes, and several evenly spaced spikes protruding from the back of his head. And confirmation of this description has been found through several busts of Helios that were excavated in the remains of the ancient city, such as this one on display in the Archaeological Museum of Rhodes. Hey, wait a second. This bust has several empty holes in the back of its head, which probably served as insertion points for decorative metal spines, just like the ones seen on the coins. These spikes represented a very important characteristic of Helios in Hellenistic artwork, his solar crown of radiant light and flame. It should be noted that this face and hair of Helios had a greater significance to an ancient audience than it does to us, because, well, the statue in reality wasn't just a depiction of Helios, but a figure that was perhaps just as important, if not more so, to the ancient Greek world. With his tousled long ringlets, to the pout in his lips, to the slight tilt of his head, the popular face of the Rhoidian Helios bears an uncanny resemblance to the young conqueror, Alexander the Great. This was very likely no mere coincidence. If you remember, Charles's old master was Alexander's own personal sculptor, and Lysippus had spent a great deal of time around the king in life, perfecting his image, and no doubt a bit of these skills and techniques rubbed off on Charles during his training. But even larger than that, the importance of Alexander to the entire Mediterranean world during this period of history cannot be overstated. Even just 50 years removed from his death, the memory of Alexander was still fresh in the minds of older men who had known or heard of the general's great triumphs when they were only young boys. Some very well might have fought alongside him. In short, the 32-year-old had quickly become a Hellenistic idol, an icon, a legendary hero of the distant golden age of Greece, like Heracles or Achilles. Come again. He had become a demigod of sorts in his own right. Fanboy cults of worship had sprouted up around him, and Alexander had embraced this movement when he was alive, frequently dressing up like deities, even female ones like Artemis, as a sign of his divinity. The dude had 70 cities named after himself. His name had become so ubiquitous, admired, and legendary that by the time of Julius Caesar, about as distant to him as we are to George Washington, that the best way to describe him is, as one historian has put it, the Jesus before Jesus, a cultural hero. Rhodes is filled with images of Helios that have a very Alexandrian quality about them. So the Colossus of Rhodes might not have just been a depiction of Helios per se, but Alexander cosplaying as Helios, in a way a curious fusion of both the god and the man. Somewhat jarring to us in the modern day, the tallest statue in the entire ancient world was most likely completely naked, save for maybe a cape or some drapery over one arm. This kept in line with the divine image of most godly statues of the time, which were commonly depicted in the nude. Seeing a nude body, especially a man's, was not exactly a rare or taboo occurrence. Public artwork and graffiti regularly depicted what we would consider vulgar images. Athletic activities in Greek society were often conducted with participants in near, if not complete, nudity, as this was considered most comfortable for the athletes. As such, the statue would have displayed a very strong muscular physique, the very ideal of ancient Mediterranean body standards. One can only picture what it must have been like to have your lunch break sitting underneath the Colossus's mighty dong. The exact pose or position the statue held while it still stood is perhaps one of the greatest mysteries. As briefly touched on before, no contemporary account mentions the pose, probably because they were written long after the statue had already fallen. The all too popular straddling and torch-holding poses are nothing more than improbable conjecture. Modern engineers and historians now understand that the Colossus would have held a pretty rigid pose, with pillar-like legs relatively close together and underneath the body as to best support its enormous weight. Beyond this, however, we can say little. Archaeology once again can possibly assist us in answering this question. A damaged wall relief has been uncovered in what was once an ancient temple located in the old city of Rhodes, and it is very possible that this temple was even nearby the statue itself. The relief depicts a figure with one hand raised above its head, in a sort of sailor's salute. Some archaeologists have interpreted this figure as the only contemporary depiction of the Colossus beyond its face. And there might be some logic to this. If this theory holds true, the bronze Helios Alexander would have shaded his eyes with his right hand against the glare of the sun and the ocean. This would be very fitting with the statue's Alexandrian qualities, as it would symbolically represent the Lycidian gaze. The great conqueror straining his eyes against the sun, looking over the horizon to the bright and glorious future ahead, searching for new lands, mysteries, and adventures to be had. It is an alluring theory to be sure, and entirely possible, but other archaeologists looking at the same relief think it might just be a depiction of a mere human athlete, rather than the sun god statue. Whatever pose the statue possessed, its coloration is pretty well understood. The bronze plating would have shined bright orange or gold in the sun, for a time at least. Although most modern illustrations depict the statue clean and gleaming, in truth, for the majority of the statue's lifetime, it would have been a bluish-green color. And this is almost exactly like the Statue of Liberty. In 1886, shortly after completion, we know that Lady Liberty herself was once orange, just like the Colossus was. But after about 1 year, she started to turn a crimson red, then a dark brown after 3 years, and then a dark then light green after about 10 to 30 years. And it can be inferred that Helios probably underwent a similar skin coloration progression. Why is this? All copper and bronze metals will over time react or oxidize with the surrounding air, and naturally build up a greenish film or covering called patina. Salt and sea spray accelerates this natural process, causing exposed bronze and copper near the ocean to tarnish rather quickly. This green film can be removed through buffering. In fact, in 1906, there was once debate over if the layer patina on the Statue of Liberty should be cleaned, but this was ultimately rejected. Removing it would be actually more trouble than it's worth, as it provides a layer protection from corrosion for the metal underneath, and the ancient Greeks were likely aware of this protective property. It is certainly interesting to wonder if conversations like the ones in 1906 occurred in the ancient city of Rhodes over 2,000 years before. There would have been many inhabitants who had grown up and witnessed the statue change colors like a chameleon over the course of their lifetimes, from orange to red to brown to finally green. 54 years after its completion, the great Colossus of Rhodes, symbol of the ancient city's victory, would likely have not only been green, but covered in bird droppings with gull nests nestled between the spikes of his crown. A little older and a little changed, but still standing just as tall. But then, the earth shook. It was a warm and peaceful night in the city of Rhodes in the year 226 BCE. Sailors gambled and drank in the pubs down by the harbor. Children and dogs raced up and down the lamplit streets. Pickpockets and thieves prowled the dark alleys for easy prey. A young couple kissed on a high balcony. Rhodes was at its most prosperous and beautiful. It was one of the richest ports in the Mediterranean, possibly only rivaled by Alexandria. It was a city of singers and poets and artists. It must have been an ordinary and uneventful night for the most part. Suddenly, the ground shook with a violent tremble, and it would be as if the earth beneath the city was about to split apart and swallow its inhabitants whole. Shingles fell, columns crumbled, and buildings were reduced to piles of rubble and brick. Over 1,000 screams, a great monstrous groan of metal came in the direction of the harbor, and then a crash. A huge earthquake had rocked the city. The exact level of destruction is unclear. All we know is that it was the worst earthquake Rhodes had experienced in living memory. Entire temples collapsed, and many homes and businesses were leveled, leaving hundreds dead and many more homeless. Above all else, Helios himself was not spared, as this pathetic scientific figure proclaims. Strabo says during the earthquake, Helios broke apart at the knees, landing flat on his face with a large thud. He might have even rung like a massive bell. The Colossus of Rhodes, who stood for 54 years, was rendered into a pile of smashed and twisted metal in a matter of seconds. One could have lived to see both its construction and its destruction within their lifetimes. It is believed that the island of Rhodes once had a population of 200,000, 3 times the amount of people who live on it today. No doubt the earthquake of 226 BCE affected thousands. Some historians have suggested a tsunami struck the island, but this hasn't been proven. The damage was extensive to say the least, and the aftermath of this event shook the Greek world. Much of the harbor and commercial buildings had been ruined, having a huge effect on trade. After the tremor stopped and survivors pulled from the ruins, many foreign cities, once enemies of the Rhodians, offered to assist Rhodes in its reconstruction. For example, ships from Rhodes were exempt from harbor taxes in neighboring ports, out of respect for their loss. Most significantly, Ptolemy III, grandson to the very Ptolemy the Rhodians had once refused to betray, offered to re-erect their iconic Colossus, but the Rhodians declined his offer. An oracle had received a revelation from the sun god himself, who said the statue had displeased him. And yeah, it seems like the city just left the statue there in a heap for a long time. 800 years. The rubble would become a source of awe and intrigue to the Romans. And archaeology indicates that the Colossus's familiar face persisted on Rhodian coinage long after its collapse. From there, we hear nothing of it for many centuries. The last mention of the statue appears in the year 653 CE, when a Muslim caliph captured and sacked the city of Rhodes. The remains of the once marvelous sun god were unceremoniously melted down and auctioned off to the highest bidder, a nameless Jewish merchant from Edessa. Loaded onto the backs of 900 camels, the Colossus wanders away from us into the eastern desert and disappears from history. All attempts to locate any piece of it have failed. They have probably circulated around and changed so many hands it would be impossible to trace their origins. Over the ensuing centuries, much about the Colossus was forgotten, and as we have discussed, legends sprung up to fill their place. In fact, over time, even the location where the statue once stood in the city was forgotten. To this day, its placement in Rhodes is unknown. Although little direct evidence remains, archaeology has proposed 3 candidates. The fabled statue might have loomed over the massive main temple of Helios, near the center of the city. Or maybe it stood atop the high hill, near the second, smaller temple of Helios in the Acropolis of Rhodes. But my personal favorite, and what I think is the most attractive candidate, is that the statue was located on what is today the Fort of St. Nicholas. There might be a grain of truth in that age-old myth of the man-spreading Helios, in the sense that it overlooked the harbor, and the sea level was much lower back then than it is today. The Fort of St. Nicholas, formerly the Church of St. Nicholas, is a military fortification built by Christians in the 1400s at the end of a natural mole. The foundations of this fortification are rather curious. They are far too fine and intricately cut to be hidden underneath the floor of a simple military base or church. It very well might be that these mystery blocks were once the podium that the Colossus proudly stood atop, repurposed after he fell. Additionally, strewn in the surf around the mole are oddly sized boulders that might have originated from within the Colossus's metal shell. The stone guts, once used to prevent him from falling over, now spilled out into the ocean. This was not uncommon. Many pagan places of worship were repurposed by later Christians, often building churches directly on top of what were previously temples to old gods. The main temple of Helios in Rhodes, for example, was actually converted into a citadel for Christian knights during the Crusades, and then re-converted into the palace of the Grand Master of the Knights of Rhodes in the 1400s, where it stays today. If we favor the Fort St. Nicholas interpretation, a lighthouse, ironically just about as tall, has filled old Helios's almost exact spot, over 2,000 years later. The story of the Colossus of Rhodes, last wonder of the ancient world, is a long and twisted one, filled with gaps and mysteries. Although its reign of 54 years was short, the statue left a pretty large and long-lived impact on history, even if this impact is often overlooked by many. For example, the statue's solar crown of spikes would later become a staple of several sun deities in the Mediterranean, from Apollo to the Roman Sol Invictus. One day it would even be adopted by Christians, serving as both the prototype of the crowns of medieval European kings and the halos floating above the heads of angels and saints in Christian artwork. Lady Liberty even has this exact same crown atop her head. All of it can, at least in part, be traced back to good old Helios. Under St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican City, there is a secret tomb that was only discovered accidentally. Its walls are surrounded by mosaics of Christian images and stories, and among them is a man riding a chariot across the sky, with a beardless face, curly flowing hair, and a tilted head with a crown of radiant beams of light, just slightly reminiscent of a familiar face. This might be among one of the earliest images of Jesus Christ in artwork, and it appears to have been influenced, however slightly, by the Colossus's ghostly bronze fingers. As people forgot more and more about Rhodes' great icon and replaced it with exaggeration and myth, to many Westerners the Colossus represented this fabulous golden age of history. And in some ways it does. The Hellenistic period brought about by Alexander the Great, I think, is best characterized as a period where people dreamed big and fell short, burned bright but faded quickly, perhaps best personified through Dinocrates of Rhodes, Alexander's chief architect and the mastermind behind Ptolemy's city of Alexandria. He famously had wanted to carve an entire mountain into an unimaginably gigantic statue of a man cradling a whole city in his palm. Men in his city would wake up and see this, a proposal that would have put Mount Rushmore to shame and make the Colossus of Rhodes look like a mere toy, something out of Middle-earth. No one could doubt Dinocrates' ambition, and his suggestion was unsurprisingly rejected because he had not even bothered to think about how to feed such a city in the harsh terrain of Mount Athos. It was an age that seemed without limits, through the sheer willpower of the human spirit. If you could dream it, you could make it happen. But much as the Rhoidians and Alexander learned, the brightest flames live the shortest, and everything, eventually, comes tumbling down. Thank you so much for watching this.